What if I told you that behind Victorian England's polished manners and royal etiquette was a family so scandalous that it blurred the line between royalty, betrayal, and forbidden desire? A teenage girl becomes the secret lover of the future King of England. Her children marry into Europe's richest dynasties, while rumors whisper that one of them may carry royal blood. Mistresses become duchesses. Stepmothers marry stepsons. Fortunes are won. Marriages destroyed, and reputations buried. Yet the truth refuses to stay dead. This isn't fiction. This isn't gossip. This is the true story of the Cornwallis West family, a dynasty where power came at the cost of love, and scandal outlived royalty itself. And once you hear how it begins, you won't believe how it ends. Long before the Cornwallis West family became synonymous with scandal, whispered affairs, and marriages that shocked Europe, their name meant something far more respectable. It meant power earned slowly, across centuries, through loyalty to the crown, service in war, and proximity to the machinery of empire. This was not a family that rose overnight. They were built, generation by generation, on bloodlines that reached back into the earliest chapters of British expansion. At the center of this lineage stood William Cornwallis West. Born on March 20th, 1835, into a world that expected greatness from him before he ever spoke his first word. His very name carried weight. It opened doors. It invited assumptions. And yet, it also carried a burden few could escape. The expectation to live up to ancestors whose shadows were impossibly long. On his father's side, William descended from the West family, a name deeply woven into Britain's political and military elite. His grandfather, Frederick West, served as a member of Parliament, continuing a tradition of public service that stretched back generations. Frederick himself was descended from John West, the first Earl de la Warr, a powerful military commander and statesman of the 18th century. The de la Warr name was not merely aristocratic, it was imperial, one of their ancestors. Thomas West, the third Baron de la Warr, had sailed along the North American coastline in the early 17th century. His expeditions were so significant that an entire region would later bear his name, Delaware, even centuries later. The echo of that legacy lingered, a reminder that the Cornwallis West bloodline had helped shape not only Britain, but the modern world beyond its shores. On his mother's side, William inherited a different, yet equally prestigious legacy. The Whitby family, into which his mother was born, had long-standing ties to the British Royal Navy. In the early 19th century, William's grandmother, Mary Ann Whitby, became the adoptive heir of Admiral William Cornwallis, one of Britain's most respected naval commanders during the American Revolutionary War and the French Revolutionary Wars. Admiral Cornwallis died without children. His estates, influence, and name passed instead to Mary Ann in an era obsessed with lineage. This inheritance was no small matter. She adopted Cornwallis as part of her name, ensuring that it would not vanish with the admiral's death. When Mary Ann's descendants later combined the names Cornwallis and West, it was more than a surname. It was a declaration, a signal to the world that this family embodied both military command and political authority, land and legacy, tradition and privilege. By the time William Cornwallis West was born, this heritage had materialized into stone and land. The family possessed Ruthin Castle, a medieval fortress in North Wales whose thick walls and ancient towers stood as silent witnesses to centuries of conflict and rule. They also owned Newlands Manor in Hampshire, a more refined estate that reflected the gentler face of aristocratic life, country politics, social gatherings, and quiet influence exercised behind closed doors. To outsiders, the Cornwallis West family appeared unassailable. Old money, old names, old power, and yet Beneath that surface lay a quieter truth. William Cornwallis West was not a conqueror. He was not a visionary. He was, by the standards of his ancestors, almost ordinary. He trained as a lawyer in his youth and was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn in 1862, one of the most prestigious legal institutions in England. He pursued a respectable career, serving as a minor military official and later entering politics. Between 1885 and 1892, he sat in Parliament as a Member of Parliament, fulfilling what many would consider a successful public life, but in a family that produced earls, admirals, and empire builders. William's achievements felt modest. He governed when he was expected to govern. He served when service was required. He maintained the family name, but he did not elevate it. No one could have predicted that the most explosive chapter in the Cornwallis West history would not come from war, politics, or conquest, but from marriage, because while William embodied restraint, tradition, and duty, the woman he would later marry embodied something far more dangerous to Victorian society: desire, ambition, and scandal. Her name was Patsy Fitzpatrick, and when she entered the Cornwallis West family, centuries of carefully cultivated respectability would begin to fracture, slowly at first, then all at once. What had taken generations to build would be shaken not by enemies or revolutions, but by secrets whispered in drawing rooms, relationships forbidden by rank, and a single question that would haunt the family for decades. How much power is too much when it's fueled by intimacy with a king? And that story had only just begun. If history had been kinder, William Cornwallis West might have been remembered as a competent gentleman of his era, educated, well-connected, and dutiful. But history is rarely kind to men born beneath towering legacies. It measures them not by their own achievements, but by what they failed to become from a young age. William understood exactly who he was supposed to be. He was raised in a world where portraits of dead ancestors stared down from paneled walls, where dinner conversations casually referenced wars, titles, and favors owed at court. The past was not distant, it was present, watching, judging. Every choice William made carried the unspoken comparison to men who had commanded fleets, governed colonies, or reshaped continents. He did not rebel against this weight. He accepted it. William was educated as befitted a man of his standing, polished in manners, disciplined in thought. Law offered him something the battlefield did not: structure, predictability, and a sense of earned respect without physical risk. When he was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn in 1862, it marked the completion of a path chosen not out of passion, but out of propriety. In Victorian Britain, respectability was currency, and William possessed it in abundance. Yet respectability was also limiting. He lived in an era obsessed with appearances, where aristocratic families were expected to project moral stability, social control, and quiet authority. Public scandal was not merely embarrassing, it was existential. A single rumor could corrode decades of prestige. William understood this better than most. His political career reflected the same cautious temperament. As a Member of Parliament between 1885 and 1892, he was diligent but unremarkable. He spoke when required, voted predictably, and avoided extremes. He was not a reformer, nor a firebrand. He was safe. To the public, that safety was reassuring. To history, it was forgettable. Behind closed doors. However, the reality of the Cornwallis West finances told a more uncomfortable story. While the family name remained impressive, the wealth behind it was increasingly strained. Maintaining castles, estates, staff, And social obligations was expensive. Old money did not always mean liquid money. Ruthin Castle required constant upkeep. Newlands Manor demanded appearances. Society demanded generosity. Like many aristocratic families of the late 19th century, the Cornwallis Wests were rich in prestige but vulnerable in practice. Their survival depended not just on tradition, but on strategic marriages. And William knew this. Marriage, for him, was never imagined as romance. It was an alliance, a stabilizing force, a means of preservation. His future wife would not be chosen for passion, but for suitability, someone young enough to bear heirs, respectable enough to protect the family name, and compliant enough to accept the life assigned to her. What William did not anticipate was that fate would offer him a bride who satisfied those requirements on paper, while carrying within her the potential to detonate everything he represented. When Patsy Fitzpatrick entered his life, she did not arrive as a scandal. Not yet. To the untrained eye, she was simply a beautiful young woman from a respectable Anglo-Irish family. Her lineage, though less illustrious than William's, was far from common. The Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory traced their power back to medieval Ireland, having survived centuries of political upheaval by adapting, by aligning themselves with English rule rather than resisting it. By the 19th century, the Fitzpatricks were loyal members of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, intermarried with English and Scottish noble families. Patsy's upbringing reflected this dual identity. Irish fire beneath English polish. She was born on October 28, 1854, into a world already shrinking for women of her class. Beauty was an asset. Youth was leverage. Obedience was expected. But Patsy was never meant to be obedient, even as a teenager. She possessed a magnetism that drew attention effortlessly. Her looks were remarked upon. Her presence lingered. And, more dangerously, she understood the power she held long before society was ready to acknowledge it. By the time William noticed her, she was already standing at the edge of something far larger than either of them. Rumors had begun to circulate, quietly, carefully, among those who knew how to listen. Whispers of a clandestine relationship, of stolen moments, of a girl far too young and a man far too powerful. A man who happened to be the heir to the British throne. William did not yet know the full truth, but forces beyond his control were already in motion, because in Victorian England, when scandal threatened to touch the monarchy, it was never allowed to explode publicly. It was contained, redirected, buried beneath respectable arrangements. And William Cornwallis West, steady, reliable, respectable William, was about to become one of those arrangements. The marriage that would define his life was not born of love or even desire. It was born of damage control. And as the machinery of aristocratic society quietly began to turn, one question loomed over everything that followed. Was William marrying a young woman, or was he marrying the consequences of a secret that could shake the crown itself? The answer would shape not only his fate, but the destiny of an entire family. By the early 1870s, the situation surrounding Patsy Fitzpatrick had become impossible to ignore. What had begun as whispers in drawing rooms hardened into something far more dangerous. Awareness. Too many people knew. Too many servants had seen too much. Too many carefully timed absences required explanation. In Victorian Britain, discretion was everything, but secrecy had limits. Especially when the secret involved Prince Edward, the son of Queen Victoria and the future King of England. Edward was already married. Patsy was barely more than a child. The consequences, if exposed, would have been catastrophic. So the solution was not justice, nor morality, but containment. A marriage would end the rumors. A respectable husband would absorb the scandal. A legitimate household would make the story disappear. And that husband needed to be someone trustworthy. discreet, well-born, and unlikely to ask too many questions. William Cornwallis West fit perfectly to William. The proposal arrived wrapped in urgency and reassurance. He was presented with the young bride of suitable lineage, praised for her beauty and charm, and described as someone who had made a youthful indiscretion that now required swift correction. The language was careful. The truth was not. He was twice her age. She was 17, on paper. The match made sense. A Cornwallis West marrying into the Fitzpatrick family carried no social risk. The union would produce heirs. It would stabilize both households. It would appear, to the outside world, entirely proper. What was not discussed openly, but understood, was that this marriage served a higher purpose. It would place a respectable barrier between Patsy and the most powerful man in Britain's future. William agreed, whether out of duty, ambition, or a genuine belief that he could offer Patsy a safe and structured life. History cannot say for certain. What is clear is that the marriage was arranged with speed, efficiency, and silence. In 1872, William Cornwallis West married Patsy Fitzpatrick. The ceremony itself was unremarkable, by design. There was no extravagant celebration, no prolonged courtship, no indulgence in romance. The goal was not joy. It was resolution. From the moment the vows were exchanged, the imbalance was undeniable. William brought with him stability, age, and expectation. Patsy brought youth, beauty, and a past that could not be spoken aloud. Their marriage existed not as a partnership, but as a solution. And solutions rarely make happy homes, almost immediately. The distance between them became apparent. William was methodical, reserved, shaped by routine and responsibility. Patsy was restless, emotionally charged, and far too young to be sealed into the rigid life of an aristocratic wife. She had already known intimacy that carried danger and intensity. Domestic respectability felt suffocating by comparison. Still, she played her role. Within a year, the first child was born. In 1873, Mary Teresa Cornwallis West came into the world. She would later be known to everyone simply as Daisy, a name that softened her origins, masking the complexity that surrounded her birth. To society, her arrival confirmed the marriage's success. To William, she was proof of duty fulfilled. In 1874, a son followed, George Cornwallis West, and with George's birth, the whispers returned. Too soon. Some said, too coincidental. Others murmured, his resemblance, his timing, invited questions no one dared to ask aloud. Many would later speculate that George was not William's son at all, but rather the biological child of Prince Edward. There was no proof. There never would be. But in aristocratic circles, suspicion did not require evidence, only proximity and motive. William never publicly acknowledged the rumors, if he believed them. He buried that belief beneath duty. George was raised as his son, carried his name, and inherited his position. Silence, once again, served as the family's armor. In 1877, a third child was born, Constance Cornwallis West. Known within the family as Sheila, her arrival completed what Victorian society demanded of a marriage, a male heir and additional offspring to secure the line. And then, unexpectedly, the children stopped coming. Patsy was only 22 when Constance was born, by every medical expectation of the time. She should have had many fertile years ahead. Instead, the Cornwallis West household fell quiet. Some suggested health complications. Others pointed to the emotional and physical distance between husband and wife. Whatever the reason, the marriage had already hardened into something formal and restrained, functioning outwardly, fractured inwardly. William focused on his career and responsibilities. Patsy, increasingly isolated, maintained a connection to the world she had never truly left behind, despite the marriage meant to separate them. Prince Edward remained present, not openly, not officially, but persistently. He visited the Cornwallis West seaside property at Milford-on-Sea, far from the scrutiny of Queen Victoria's court. Patsy, ostracized by parts of high society for her perceived impropriety, found refuge in those private meetings, and Edward, ever indulgent, never fully let her go. What had been designed as an ending became merely a pause, and as the children grew within the walls of privilege and silence, one uncomfortable truth lingered beneath the surface of their lives. This family was not built on love. It was built on management, of reputations, of secrets, of power. The Cornwallis West name still stood tall, but its foundations were already cracking, and the generation raised inside that tension, Daisy, George, and Constance, would one day take those fractures and turn them into something the world could no longer ignore, long before she became a liability that needed to be managed. Patsy Fitzpatrick was simply a girl born into a world that promised privilege, but offered very little freedom. She entered that world on October 28, 1854, into the Fitzpatrick family of Upper Ossory, an old Anglo-Irish lineage that had survived centuries of upheaval by mastering one essential skill: adaptation. The Fitzpatricks had once been Gaelic lords, rulers of large swaths of Ireland dating back to the medieval period. But when English domination became inevitable in the 16th century, they chose accommodation over extinction. Their head, Barnaby Fitzpatrick, accepted an English title, Baron of Upper Ossory, and with it came Anglicization, English customs, English loyalties, even an English version of their Irish name, while many Irish noble families were stripped of land and power in the centuries that followed. The Fitzpatricks endured. By the 19th century, they were firmly embedded within the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, not English enough to rule at the center, but privileged enough to live comfortably at the edge of power. Patsy grew up surrounded by this contradiction. She was raised with the manners, education, and expectations of a noblewoman, yet she lived in a society where women of her class were treated as currency, valuable not for who they were, but for whom they might marry. A daughter's beauty was an asset, her obedience was assumed, her ambition, if it existed, had to be hidden. But Patsy did not hide hers well. From an early age, she stood out. Contemporary accounts consistently described her as striking, dark-haired, expressive, and possessed of a presence that drew attention even when she said nothing at all. More importantly, she understood that attention was power. Unlike many girls raised to submit quietly to their futures, Patsy was curious, restless, aware that the life prescribed to her, marriage to a suitable man, children, polite invisibility, felt unbearably small. She wanted more. What that more looked like was still undefined when she was 16 years old. But fate, careless and cruel, defined it for her. It was around this time that Patsy encountered Prince Edward, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and the future King Edward VII. He was already in his early 30s, long married, and notorious for indulgence. Edward had appetites for food, pleasure, women that were barely concealed even by royal discretion. To Edward, Patsy was captivating. To Patsy, Edward represented something intoxicating, proximity to the center of the world. What followed was a clandestine relationship, one conducted in shadows, protected by servants, schedules, and silence. The imbalance of power was staggering. But in the rigid moral framework of Victorian England, It was Patsy who bore all the risk. She was a teenage girl involved with the heir to the throne. Discovery meant ruin. Yet for a time, secrecy held. Patsy tasted a version of life few women ever did. Private attention from the most powerful man in the kingdom. Whispered promises. The illusion of choice. It was dangerous. It was unsustainable. And it was thrilling. But secrets rarely stay contained. As rumors began to surface, alarm spread quickly, not among moral guardians, but among those responsible for preserving the monarchy's image. Queen Victoria's court had no tolerance for scandal, especially scandal involving her son and a minor. Patsy was swiftly ostracized, invitations disappeared, doors closed. Society turned cold, not toward Edward, but toward the girl deemed disposable. The solution was immediate and decisive. She would be married off. Marriage would sanitize the narrative. A husband would legitimize her. The scandal would be transferred, absorbed, and neutralized. Patsy's feelings were irrelevant. Her future was no longer her own. She was 17 when the decision was made. And in that moment, without ceremony, without sympathy, Patsy Fitzpatrick ceased to be a girl with dangerous desires and became a problem to be solved. The man chosen to solve it was William Cornwallis West. What no one fully understood. Not Edward, not William, not the architects of aristocratic damage control, was that Patsy was not a passive piece on the board. She was observant, intelligent, and she never forgot the taste of power she had once been allowed to sample. The marriage might close one door, but Patsy was already thinking about the next one, because if she could no longer stand beside a future king, she would ensure that her children would stand among kings, princes, dukes, and dynasties, and in doing so, she would reshape the Cornwallis West family forever, turning a quiet aristocratic name into one that history would remember not for conquest or governance, but for scandal. If marriage was meant to end Patsy Fitzpatrick's connection to Prince Edward, it failed in the only way that truly mattered. The wedding ring did not sever the bond. It merely forced it underground. Victorian society excelled at pretending. Appearances were everything, and as long as the correct rituals were observed, reality could be ignored. Patsy, now Mrs. Cornwallis West, was expected to retreat into domestic obscurity, to become a wife, a mother, and nothing more. Officially, she did exactly that. Unofficially, her relationship with Edward endured. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, Prince Edward was no longer merely the heir apparent. He was a powerful political and social figure in his own right. His marriage to Princess Alexandra had long since cooled into formality, and his reputation as a womanizer was an open secret among those who mattered. Patsy was not just another mistress. She was familiar, trusted, dangerous. They met discreetly, away from the suffocating scrutiny of Queen Victoria's court. One of their favored refuges was the Cornwallis West seaside residence at Milford-on-Sea, a place far enough from London to discourage curiosity, yet respectable enough to arouse no suspicion. There, the illusion of normality could be suspended. Edward arrived not as a prince, but as a man indulging a long-standing attachment. Patsy, isolated from polite society and emotionally abandoned within her marriage, found in him the one constant reminder that she had once mattered profoundly to someone powerful. This persistence had consequences. Queen Victoria, rigid in her moral expectations and deeply distrustful of any woman who exerted influence over her son, never forgave Patsy. The royal court quietly froze her out. Invitations stopped. Social advancement stalled, where once she had been admired for her beauty. She was now tolerated at best and suspected at worst, but Patsy did not retreat. Instead, she adapted. If she could not hold power openly, she would exercise it indirectly, If society would not welcome her, she would shape it from the edges, and if her own reputation could not be salvaged, she would invest everything in her children. This was the pivot on which Patsy's life turned. She began to understand something most women of her time never fully grasped. Proximity to power was more valuable than respectability. Edward, indulgent and sentimental, was susceptible to influence, especially from those who appealed to his vanity and sense of obligation. Patsy appealed to both. She reminded him of their past, of loyalty, of discretion, and, crucially, of gratitude. Whatever Edward's feelings had once been, he did not abandon those who had known him before the crown. Through subtle suggestion rather than demand, Patsy positioned her children as beneficiaries of that connection. They were presented at the right moments, introduced to the right people, spoken of in flattering terms to the right ears. What looked, from the outside, like extraordinary luck was in fact careful orchestration. William Cornwallis West watched this from a distance. He did not challenge her, whether through resignation, denial, or quiet calculation. He allowed the arrangement to continue, as long as appearances were maintained. He fulfilled his role. He remained the husband, the father, the respectable shield behind which everything else unfolded. Yet the household itself was never warm. Patsy and William lived parallel lives under the same roof, bound by duty, separated by temperament. He was methodical, conservative, emotionally restrained. She was volatile, ambitious, and deeply aware that time was not on her side. Youth had given her leverage once. Now she needed results. Her children were growing. Daisy, striking and charismatic. George, charming but unsettled. Constance, observant and quietly ambitious. Patsy studied them with the same strategic eye once turned toward Edward himself. They were her legacy, and she would not allow them to drift into obscurity the way she had been expected to do. By the late 1880s, the Cornwallis West children were being positioned within elite circles far beyond what their family's finances alone would have allowed. They mingled with royalty. They were noticed by dynasties whose wealth dwarfed that of England's old aristocracy. This did not happen by chance. Behind each introduction lay a conversation. Behind each invitation, a favor quietly returned. Edward's influence, never formal, always deniable, flowed through these arrangements like an unseen current. Society might still judge Patsy harshly, but it could not ignore her effectiveness. And yet, this influence came at a cost. The closer Patsy moved to power through her children, the more fragile her position became. She lived perpetually on the edge of exposure. One misstep, one scandal too many, and everything she had built could collapse. But caution was not her nature. Patsy had already crossed the most dangerous line imaginable when she was 16. Compared to that, navigating the hypocrisies of aristocratic Europe felt almost manageable. What she did not fully anticipate was that the same forces she manipulated, desire, ambition, entitlement, would one day turn inward, consuming her children's marriages from within, for now. However, the strategy appeared flawless. The Cornwallis West name, once quiet and respectable, was moving outward into royal courts, industrial fortunes, and continental power. And at the center of it all stood a woman society had tried to erase. Patsy Fitzpatrick had not been silenced. She had simply learned to speak through others. The next chapter of the family's story would prove just how far that voice could reach and how destructive it could become once unleashed. By the early 1890s, Patsy Fitzpatrick understood a truth that few women of her era dared to articulate. Power did not need to be inherited to be real. It only needed access, her own access. Once dangerously direct, had become conditional and fragile. Age was beginning to dull the fascination she once held over Prince Edward, and society was far less forgiving to women who lingered too long in scandal. But Patsy was not interested in prolonging her own spotlight. She was building something longer lasting. Her children were no longer infants sheltered from consequence. They were becoming currency, socially valuable, visually impressive, and, most importantly, useful. Of the three, Mary Teresa Cornwallis West, known universally as Daisy, was the most obvious asset. From adolescence, Daisy possessed the kind of beauty that commanded attention without effort. Tall, graceful, and self-assured, she moved through rooms as if she belonged in them, because, increasingly, she did. Patsy watched her eldest daughter carefully. She ensured Daisy was seen at the right events, introduced to the right families, and framed not merely as attractive, but as exceptional. Daisy was not raised to wait for a proposal. She was raised to inspire competition behind the scenes. Patsy's connection to Prince Edward remained invaluable. Though he was careful, always careful, Edward did not forget old loyalties. He understood what Patsy wanted without her ever needing to ask directly. And so, doors opened. Daisy was welcomed into circles that would otherwise have been closed to a family of declining English wealth. She mingled with royalty and foreign aristocracy, particularly from continental Europe, where immense industrial fortunes were reshaping old noble hierarchies. This was not accidental. European dynasties were hungry for prestige, while British aristocratic families increasingly needed money. Daisy represented the perfect intersection: English nobility, royal proximity, and youth. When Daisy met Prince Hans Heinrich of the House of von Hochberg, it felt, at least on the surface, like a fairy tale. Hans was 12 years older than Daisy and already established as one of the wealthiest aristocrats in Europe. His family's vast estates in Silesia, rich in coal and iron ore, had transformed the von Hochbergs into industrial giants. In 1883, he had been granted the title Prince of Pless, a recognition not only of lineage, but of economic power. To Patsy, Hans was not merely a suitor, he was a solution. The Cornwallis West family was struggling financially. The von Hochbergs were not. The match would secure Daisy's future and elevate the entire family's standing overnight. There was, however, a complication. Before Hans entered the picture, Daisy had shown interest in a young British Army officer. The relationship was earnest, emotionally charged, and most importantly, unsuitable. He had no great fortune, no foreign title, no strategic value. Patsy acted swiftly. Through her connections, arrangements were made. The officer was sent abroad, assigned to fight in the Zulu Wars in South Africa. Within months, he was dead. The removal was never acknowledged as deliberate. History would record it as coincidence, but within the Cornwallis West family, it was understood that Daisy's path had been forcibly corrected shortly afterward. The marriage to Hans Heinrich was negotiated. The von Hochbergs paid for the wedding themselves, a quiet acknowledgement that the Cornwallis Wests could not afford the spectacle such a union demanded. As a wedding gift, the couple received a 400-room castle, an almost unimaginable symbol of excess where Europe's elite would later gather in lavish displays of privilege. Daisy became Princess Daisy of Pless. From the outside, it looked like triumph. From the inside, it marked the beginning of another carefully managed prison. Meanwhile, George Cornwallis West followed a different, less controlled path, raised under the shadow of rumors regarding his parentage. George grew up restless, searching for identity and validation. He entered the British military, as was customary for young men of his class, but discipline never fully contained him. Where Daisy was groomed for diplomacy, George drifted toward excess. In the late 1890s, he began a relationship that shocked even a society accustomed to scandal. He fell in love with Lady Randolph Churchill. Known as Jenny Churchill, the American-born widow of Lord Randolph Churchill and the mother of Winston Churchill. She was older, she was experienced, and she was socially formidable. When they married in 1900, George became stepfather to a boy who would one day lead Britain through its darkest hour, despite being only 16 days older than Winston himself. The irony was not lost on anyone. To some observers, the marriage appeared strategic. To others, it seemed psychological. A young man drawn to maternal authority after a childhood defined by emotional distance. Whatever the truth, the union drew George deeper into a world of expense, theater, and instability. Finally, there was Constance Cornwallis West, the quietest of the three, where Daisy dazzled and George drifted. Constance observed. She married Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, in 1901, one of the wealthiest men in Britain, if not the world. The marriage was widely understood to have been facilitated through Patsy's influence and Edward's approval. By then King Edward VII, the scale of Grosvenor's fortune was staggering. The marriage elevated Constance instantly, cementing the Cornwallis West children's position at the very summit of British society. Patsy had succeeded beyond expectation. Her children had married into royalty, industrial dynasties, and historic wealth. The girl, once cast out as a liability, had engineered one of the most remarkable social ascents of her era. But success, when achieved through manipulation rather than harmony, carries consequences behind the titles, castles, and public smiles. The foundations of these marriages were already unstable, built on obligation, ambition, and unresolved desire. Patsy had passed power down to her children. What she could not control was how they would survive carrying it, and soon, the very unions she had so carefully arranged would begin to unravel, dragging the Cornwallis West name into scandals far darker than the one she had once been forced to bury. When Mary Theresa Daisy Cornwallis West arrived in Silesia as Princess Daisy of Pless, Europe's aristocracy greeted her like a spectacle carefully designed for admiration. She was young, she was English, she was beautiful, and she had married into one of the richest dynasties on the continent. From the outside, Daisy's life appeared almost mythic. The Hochberg estates stretched across vast tracts of land rich in coal and iron, resources that powered the industrial age. Their wealth was not merely inherited, it multiplied daily, extracted from the ground itself, where many aristocratic families were slowly bleeding money to maintain appearances. The von Hochbergs were becoming richer with every passing year. At the heart of this world stood Pless Castle, a sprawling, opulent residence with nearly 400 rooms, surrounded by forests, gardens, and villages that existed largely to serve it. Chandeliers glittered above endless banquets. Servants moved in silence. Guests arrived in waves, princes, diplomats, generals, financiers. Daisy, barely out of girlhood, was expected to preside over it all. Her husband, Prince Hans Heinrich von Hochberg, was experienced, powerful, and accustomed to command. He had been shaped by wealth and responsibility, by expectations very different from Daisy's own. To him, marriage was a continuation of dynasty, a partnership meant to produce heirs and maintain influence. To Daisy, marriage had been an escape. She had left behind England's rigid moral codes and her mother's relentless orchestration, believing, perhaps naively, that love might grow in the space ambition had created. For a brief moment, that illusion held. Hans was attentive. The world treated her with reverence. Her transformation from aristocratic daughter to continental princess was intoxicating, but fairy tales rarely survive daily life. Almost immediately, Daisy discovered the reality beneath the grandeur. Life at Pless was governed by protocol. Every movement, every interaction, every expression was monitored by tradition and expectation. Daisy was not merely a wife, she was a symbol, expected to host, charm, and remain composed regardless of her inner state. Hans, though not cruel, was distant. He had affairs long before Daisy entered his life and saw no reason to abandon habits that wealth had always protected. Fidelity, in his world, was optional for men of his standing. Daisy learned this early. At first, she endured quietly. She fulfilled her duties, hosted lavish gatherings, and adapted to the rhythms of aristocratic Europe. In public, she radiated grace. In private, isolation crept in. Motherhood brought temporary purpose. In 1893, Daisy gave birth to a daughter who died in infancy, a loss that shattered her and briefly softened Hans's detachment. Later came 3 sons: Hans, born 1900, Alexander, 1905, and Bolko, 1910. Their births secured the Hochberg line and reinforced Daisy's position within the family, but children did not repair the marriage. As the years passed, Daisy's loneliness hardened into resentment. If Hans claimed freedom for himself, she would claim it too. What began as emotional distance evolved into mutual infidelity, a fact whispered about openly in elite circles and eagerly consumed by the press. Daisy, once the jewel of Pless, became a topic of gossip. Yet she was not passive in her decline. She read voraciously, kept extensive diaries, and developed a sharp, observant intellect. She understood the performance she was expected to give and how suffocating it was. The First World War deepened existing fractures. Germany's role in the conflict placed Daisy in an impossible position. English by birth, German by marriage, she belonged fully to neither side. War stripped the Hochberg estates of their illusion of permanence, replacing lavish excess with anxiety and political uncertainty. By the early 1920s, the marriage was irreparably broken. In 1922, Daisy and Hans divorced, a rare and scandalous outcome for aristocrats of their stature. Hans remarried quickly, taking Clotilde de Silva, a woman nearly 40 years younger than himself and the daughter of a Spanish nobleman. What followed was one of the most disturbing episodes in the family's history. Clotilde later seduced Hans's son, Bolko, divorced Hans, and married the younger man, becoming both former stepmother and wife. Children resulted from the union, creating a lineage so morally entangled that even Europe's permissive aristocracy recoiled. Daisy watched all of this from a distance. Her marriage had promised escape. Instead, it had delivered confinement, loss, and public humiliation. Yet it also gave her something unexpected: material independence and freedom from marital obligation. She left Pless no longer a naive bride, but a woman sharpened by betrayal. The castles, titles, and fortunes remained, but Daisy understood now that they were never meant to protect happiness. They existed to preserve power, regardless of who was crushed beneath it. And as she turned away from the life Patsy had engineered for her, Daisy began to do something dangerous in her own right. She started writing, in ink and memory. She would reclaim control of a story that had never truly belonged to her. What she would reveal and what she would conceal would ensure that the Cornwallis West name continued to live on. Not in silence, but in controversy. After the splendor faded, what remained of Princess Daisy of Pless was not ruin, but clarity. The divorce from Hans Heinrich von Hochberg in 1922 did not free Daisy from scrutiny. It amplified it. Aristocratic Europe, so tolerant of male indiscretion, had far less patience for a woman who refused to endure quietly. Daisy was no longer merely a beautiful English princess married into German wealth. She was now a woman who had failed to make the marriage last, a subtle but powerful accusation. Yet failure, in Daisy's case, was complicated. By the early 1920s, the world that had produced Pless Castle was collapsing. The First World War had not only redrawn borders, it had shattered illusions. Empires fell. Fortunes wavered. Titles lost their certainty. What once felt eternal suddenly appeared fragile. Daisy sensed this shift before many of her peers. During the war years, she had lived in a constant state of tension, English-born, married to a German prince, surrounded by suspicion from both sides. Loyalty became a dangerous word. Neutrality, impossible. Even within her own household, Daisy was watched, measured, questioned. The war did not cause the collapse of her marriage, but it exposed how hollow it had already become. Hans, consumed by politics, wealth management, and his own indulgences, withdrew further. Daisy, increasingly aware of her emotional isolation, withdrew inward. Where once she had hoped for affection, she now sought understanding and found it only in her own thoughts. She wrote constantly. Her diaries became companions, witnesses to truths she could not speak aloud. In them, she dissected the aristocratic world with a sharp, unsentimental eye. She described the performances expected of women, the casual cruelty of powerful men, and the loneliness that thrived beneath excess. These writings were not yet meant for publication. They were survival after the divorce. Daisy faced a choice few women of her class had ever been granted. She could disappear quietly into obscurity, or she could redefine herself. She chose the latter. While Hans remarried and plunged headlong into scandal, his grotesque entanglement with Clotilde de Silva and later with his own son Bolko, Daisy stepped away from the spectacle. She no longer competed for attention. She observed. The irony was cruel. Hans's remarriage and Clotilde's subsequent seduction of Bolko produced a scandal so extreme that even hardened aristocratic society recoiled. Children born from that union existed in a moral labyrinth that defied social categorization. The Hochberg name, once synonymous with industrial might and old-world grandeur, became entangled in whispers of degeneracy. Daisy, once blamed for her marriage's failure, suddenly looked restrained by comparison. Still, she did not escape unscathed, separated from her sons by circumstance and geography. Daisy endured the quiet grief of distance. Her eldest sons, Hans and Alexander, grew up molded by their father's world, formal, emotionally guarded, and shaped by obligation rather than affection. Bolko, the youngest, struggled most, his life ultimately marked by instability and tragedy. Daisy understood, perhaps too late, that wealth could not insulate children from chaos. It merely changed the scenery in which damage occurred. By the 1930s, she began to reclaim her voice publicly. Drawing from decades of diaries, Daisy published memoirs that were unapologetically candid by the standards of her time. She wrote of court life, royal hypocrisy, marital disappointment, and the psychological toll of aristocratic performance. The tone was neither bitter nor sentimental. It was observant, often ruthless in its honesty. Readers were fascinated. Here was a woman who had lived inside Europe's most rarefied spaces and emerged willing to describe them without reverence. Her books sold well. Her perspective felt modern, and in an era increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege. Daisy's voice resonated. She did not frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as a witness, as the Second World War loomed. Daisy's life narrowed geographically but expanded intellectually. She remained in Silesia, a region once stable, now trembling under political pressure. Nationalism surged. Borders threatened to shift again. The world she had once entered as a young bride was on the brink of annihilation. In 1943, in the midst of global war, Daisy died at the age of 70. Her death passed quietly compared to her life. There were no great ceremonies, no final triumphs, but what she left behind endured. Writings that peeled back the veneer of aristocratic life and exposed its emotional cost. Daisy Cornwallis West had entered history as a beauty. She left it as a chronicler, and in doing so, she achieved something her mother, Patsy Fitzpatrick, had never fully managed: control over her own narrative. But while Daisy's story found a measure of resolution, the Cornwallis West saga was far from finished, because while one sibling observed and recorded, another unraveled, and George Cornwallis West, shaped by rumor, indulgence, and instability, was approaching a reckoning that would end not in reflection, but in tragedy. If Daisy Cornwallis West learned to survive by observing the world with distance and discipline, her brother George Cornwallis West moved through life in the opposite way, emotionally exposed, restless, and perpetually searching for something he could never quite name. From the moment of his birth in 1874, George's place within the family was complicated. There were whispers, always whispers, that he was not truly William Cornwallis West's son, that his real father was Prince Edward, the future king. No proof ever surfaced, no acknowledgement was ever made, but the rumors followed George like a shadow, shaping how others looked at him and how he looked at himself. He grew up surrounded by privilege, yet starved of certainty. William Cornwallis West was distant and formal, a man more comfortable with duty than affection. Patsy, for all her intensity, was strategic rather than nurturing. George did not grow up feeling claimed. He grew up feeling observed, as if his existence itself carried unresolved questions. Like many young men of his class, George entered the British military. It offered structure, identity, and a sense of belonging that had always eluded him at home. But discipline never truly held him. He was impulsive, drawn to excitement, and deeply sensitive beneath a polished exterior. Where Daisy had been molded for marriage, George drifted toward art, theater, and society's more indulgent corners. By the late 1890s, his life intersected with a woman who would define his public image forever. Lady Randolph Churchill, known to most as Jenny Churchill. She was everything George was not. Older, confident, and commanding, Jenny had already lived several lives. She was American-born, widowed, and socially formidable, a woman accustomed to moving among power without apologizing for it. Most notably, she was the mother of Winston Churchill, already a rising political figure. When George and Jenny became involved, society reacted with disbelief and fascination. She was in her early 40s. He was in his mid-20s. The age difference alone was scandalous. But when they married in 1900, the situation took on a surreal quality. George became stepfather to Winston Churchill, despite being only 16 days older than him, to some observers. The marriage seemed strategic. To others, it appeared deeply psychological. George gravitated toward a woman who offered authority, attention, and emotional presence, qualities absent from his upbringing, for a time. The marriage worked. George basked in Jenny's social confidence and connections. Jenny, in turn, enjoyed his charm and devotion. Together, they occupied the fringes of high society, admired and whispered about in equal measure. But beneath the surface, cracks formed quickly. George spent freely, recklessly. Money flowed through his hands without resistance. Theater and writing fascinated him, but success remained elusive. He drifted from project to project, ambition outpacing discipline. Jenny, practical and worldly, grew frustrated. By the time their marriage ended, the separation felt inevitable rather than tragic. They divorced quietly, yet the damage lingered. George had once again lost a stabilizing force, reinforcing his lifelong pattern of attachment and collapse. In 1914, mere weeks after finalizing the divorce, George married again, this time to the actress Stella Campbell, a woman older than himself and deeply embedded in London's theatre scene. The pattern repeated. George sought intensity, admiration, and escape. Stella offered passion and proximity to the creative world he longed to master. But talent and discipline cannot be absorbed through association. And George's ambitions as a playwright never fully materialized. Financial trouble followed. By 1916, during the height of the First World War, George was forced to declare bankruptcy for a man born into privilege. Public financial failure carried a particular humiliation. The Cornwallis West name could not shield him from consequence. In response, George turned inward and backward. He began to write. His books were not works of fiction, but attempts at self-definition. He authored a biography of his ancestor, Admiral William Cornwallis, perhaps hoping that proximity to greatness might restore a sense of inherited legitimacy. He also wrote an autobiography, laying bare the contours of a life shaped by excess, insecurity, and longing. The writing brought modest income, but not peace, as years passed. George's health deteriorated. He developed Parkinson's disease, a cruel and progressive condition that stripped him of control, physically and emotionally, for a man who had always struggled with instability. The disease felt like a final betrayal by his own body. Stella remained with him until her death in 1940. After that, George was alone. The world he had once inhabited, of drawing rooms, theaters, and scandal, had changed. War reshaped society. Old aristocratic indulgences felt increasingly out of place. George, once restless and impulsive, became trapped in a body he could no longer command. On April 1st, 1951, at the age of 76, George Cornwallis West took his own life. Those close to him believed the act was deliberate, carefully planned. Even the date, April Fool's Day, was widely understood as intentional, a final, bitter irony from a man who had lived his life out of sync with expectations. George did not leave behind a dynasty. He did not leave behind triumphs. What he left behind was a portrait of a man shaped by privilege without grounding, affection without stability, and opportunity without fulfillment. In the Cornwallis West family, power flowed unevenly. Daisy observed it, Constance managed it, George was crushed beneath it. And as his story closed, only one sibling remained, quiet, calculating, and far more enduring than anyone expected. Constance Cornwallis West had watched it all unfold, and she, unlike George, would learn how to survive power without being destroyed by it. If Daisy embodied spectacle and George embodied instability, Constance Cornwallis West embodied something far rarer in her family: control. Born in 1877, Constance, known within the family as Sheila, grew up watching two powerful lessons play out in real time. From her mother, Patsy Fitzpatrick. She learned how influence could be exercised quietly, through proximity rather than authority. From her siblings, she learned the cost of excess, how beauty could become a cage, and how indulgence could become self-destruction. Constance was neither the most beautiful nor the most volatile child in the Cornwallis West household. She did not command rooms the way Daisy did, nor did she demand attention like George. Instead, she observed, she listened, she waited, and she learned. By the time she reached adulthood, Constance understood the mechanics of her world with clarity unusual even among the aristocracy. Marriage was not romance. It was leverage. Wealth was not freedom. It was insulation and survival, especially for a woman of her class, depended on choosing the right kind of power. In February 1901, she made that choice. Constance married Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, one of the richest men in Britain and, by some estimates, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world at the time. The scale of Grosvenor's fortune was difficult to comprehend. His wealth was not merely aristocratic, it was industrial, urban, and modern, rooted in vast land holdings and property developments that generated immense income to society. The match was dazzling. To those who understood its architecture, it was precise. It was widely believed that Patsy's influence, channeled through her enduring connection to King Edward VII, had helped facilitate the union. By the time of the wedding, Edward had finally ascended the throne after the long reign of Queen Victoria, and his informal power over aristocratic arrangements was at its peak. The marriage elevated Constance instantly. She became Duchess of Westminster, mistress of estates, host to royalty, and a figure of considerable social authority. Where Daisy's marriage had transported her into a foreign world, Constance's anchored her firmly at the heart of British high society. Children followed. 3 were born from the marriage: Ursula, Mary Olivia in 1902, Edward George in 1904, and Mary Constance in 1910. Tragedy struck early when Edward George died in childhood in 1909, a loss that cast a long shadow over the family. Outwardly, Constance's life appeared enviable, wealth beyond measure, status without question, and proximity to power unmatched by her siblings. Inwardly, the marriage was cold. Hugh Grosvenor was not a man inclined toward emotional intimacy. He was disciplined, controlling, and deeply private. The marriage functioned efficiently, but affection was scarce. Constance, experienced enough by now to recognize the signs, did not mistake luxury for love. She endured. For years, she fulfilled her duties flawlessly, hosting, managing estates, presenting the correct image, where Daisy had struggled against the performance. Constance mastered it. She understood that resistance invited punishment, while composure preserved leverage, but endurance has limits. By the end of the First World War, the emotional distance between Constance and Hugh had hardened into irreversibility. The war itself altered priorities, loosened social constraints, and created spaces where old rules could be bent or broken. It was during this period that Constance met John Fitzpatrick Lewis, a much younger man serving as a medical officer. Their meeting took place not in a ballroom or drawing room, but in a field hospital near Calais. Amid the chaos and exhaustion of war, the contrast could not have been sharper. Where her marriage to Hugh was defined by wealth and restraint, her connection with Lewis was defined by immediacy and emotional presence. He saw her not as a duchess, but as a woman navigating grief, responsibility, and isolation. Constance made a decision that stunned society. In 1919, she divorced the Duke of Westminster. The settlement that followed was unprecedented. Constance received the largest alimony payment in British legal history up to that point, a financial acknowledgement not only of Grosvenor's immense wealth, but of the social cost of the separation. She then married John Fitzpatrick Lewis. The choice was radical by the standards of her class, a duchess marrying a younger man without title or fortune. But unlike Daisy or George, Constance did not romanticize the decision. She calculated it. She had secured independence. She had secured financial security. And now, she secured companionship on her own terms. The marriage to Lewis did not produce children, but it proved stable and enduring for decades. They remained together, living a comparatively quiet life far removed from the turbulence that had defined Constance's upbringing. While her siblings were consumed by scandal and self-reflection, Constance faded intentionally from the spotlight. She had learned the family's most valuable lesson. Survival did not require brilliance, it required restraint. Constance Cornwallis West lived until 1970, reaching the age of 94, by the standards of her family. Her later life was almost uneventful, and that, perhaps, was her greatest achievement. But while Constance mastered endurance, the woman who had set everything in motion, Patsy Fitzpatrick, was approaching the final and most destructive chapter of her life. And this time, there would be no marriage powerful enough to contain the fallout. When Patsy Fitzpatrick died in July 1920, the reaction was not mourning, but release. For decades, she had been a destabilizing presence in aristocratic society, a woman who refused to fade into the background assigned to her. Her death closed a chapter that many preferred not to reread. There were no grand public remembrances, no royal acknowledgments, no effort to rehabilitate her reputation. And yet, in her absence, something became clear. Patsy had been the engine of the Cornwallis West family. Without her, the family no longer moved forward, it merely continued. Her children, now fully grown and shaped by lives she had orchestrated but could no longer control, stood as living evidence of both her success and her failure. Each of them carried forward a fragment of her ambition, distorted by temperament, circumstance, and consequence. Daisy, living largely apart from her children and estranged from the Hochberg world she once ruled, watched Europe tear itself apart again in the years following the First World War. Her writing gave her a voice, but not peace. She remained a woman permanently suspended between belonging and exile, too English for Germany, too continental for England. George, already unstable before Patsy's death, deteriorated further without the gravitational force that had shaped his life. Whatever unresolved questions surrounded his parentage died with her. Silence replaced speculation, but it offered no comfort. He drifted through his later years, increasingly isolated, his health declining, his sense of purpose evaporating. Constance, ever the strategist, was the only one who seemed to benefit from Patsy's absence. With her mother gone, she was free from manipulation, expectation, and competition. Her second marriage, quiet and emotionally stable, allowed her to exist outside the destructive patterns that had defined her childhood. William Cornwallis West, the man who had once served as Patsy's shield, did not live to see the final reckoning. His death in 1917 had already removed the last respectable barrier between Patsy and public condemnation. In death, as in life, he remained a peripheral figure, essential, yet invisible. What survived Patsy was not affection, but impact. The Cornwallis West name, once associated with quiet service and inherited dignity, had been transformed irrevocably. It now carried connotations of scandal, excess, emotional volatility, and moral contradiction. The family had moved closer to power than most aristocratic houses ever would, but at the cost of stability. And yet, history is rarely binary. Patsy had not failed in the way society claimed. She had secured extraordinary marriages for her children. She had elevated a financially strained English family into the highest tiers of European aristocracy. She had manipulated systems designed to exclude women and bent them, temporarily, to her will. What she had not done was build something sustainable. Her influence depended on secrecy, proximity, and constant pressure. Once she was gone, the structure collapsed inward. There was no shared identity among her children, no unifying vision, only individual lives, each bearing scars from the same source. By the early 1920s, The Cornwallis West family ceased to be a cohesive force. They no longer acted as a unit. They no longer moved together through society. They simply existed, separately, unevenly, and often unhappily. And yet, the story did not end in silence. Because while Patsy's generation faded, the consequences of her decisions began to surface more clearly. The next decades would not be defined by ambition, but by reckoning, by illness, death, memoirs, suicides, and quiet endurance. The question that now hung over the Cornwallis West legacy was no longer how far they could rise. It was this: what remains of a family when the pursuit of power has already taken everything it could take? The answer would unfold not in grand gestures or royal favor, but in the slow, unavoidable erosion of lives shaped by privilege without peace. And in that erosion, the final meaning of the Cornwallis West story would emerge. By the mid-1920s, the name Cornwallis West no longer opened doors the way it once had. It was still recognizable, still aristocratic, still faintly dangerous. But it no longer carried momentum. The world that had allowed the family to thrive on proximity to power was disappearing. The old order, built on inheritance, silence, and private arrangements, was being replaced by something harsher and less forgiving. Newspapers were bolder. Public opinion mattered. Scandal no longer dissolved quietly behind closed doors. It lingered, multiplied, and archived itself permanently. For the Cornwallis West family, this shift was devastating. They had never been architects of institutions. They had been beneficiaries of access, and access, once lost, is almost impossible to recover. Daisy. Memory as survival for Daisy, now long divorced and emotionally distant from the world of Pless. The passing years brought an unsettling realization. Her life had become a historical curiosity. She had once been one of the most photographed women in Europe, a symbol of beauty, glamour, and aristocratic excess. Now she was a relic of a vanished era, and so she did the one thing she could still control. She wrote. Her diaries, kept meticulously for decades, were no longer private refuges. They became raw material. Daisy edited, shaped, and released them as memoirs throughout the 1930s, offering readers something rare: an insider's account of aristocratic life without reverence. She wrote about royal hypocrisy, about loveless marriages, about the psychological violence hidden behind etiquette. What made her writing compelling was not bitterness, but clarity. Daisy did not portray herself as innocent. She portrayed herself as aware of how she had been used, and aware of how she had used others in return. The public was fascinated, in a world increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege. Daisy's voice felt strangely modern. She did not defend the aristocracy. She dissected it. But writing, however cathartic, did not repair the deeper fractures. Her relationship with her sons remained distant. Hans and Alexander, molded by their father's world, maintained emotional restraint. Bolko, unstable and increasingly troubled, drifted toward the scandal that would later define his brief life. Daisy had escaped her marriage, but not its consequences. George. A life slowing down for George Cornwallis West. The years after the First World War were marked by steady decline rather than dramatic collapse. The bankruptcy of 1916 had stripped him of illusions. The theater world, once so alluring, no longer offered refuge. His writing brought modest recognition, but no reinvention. He lived increasingly in the past, anchored to memories of connections that no longer mattered. As Parkinson's disease progressed, George's sense of agency diminished. For a man who had always struggled with control, the disease was uniquely cruel. Tremors, stiffness, and fatigue eroded not only his body, but his identity. Independence gave way to dependence. Social engagement narrowed. Isolation deepened. The Cornwallis West name offered no protection against time. By the late 1930s, George had become a quiet figure, still alive, still titled, but increasingly invisible. The society that once watched his every move had shifted its attention elsewhere. War loomed again. Constance. The vanishing act. If Daisy chronicled and George declined. Constance perfected disappearance. Her second marriage to John Fitzpatrick Lewis remained stable and emotionally grounded, free from the performance demanded of a duchess. Constance lived deliberately away from spectacle. She did not write memoirs. She did not cultivate nostalgia. She did not seek redemption. She simply lived. In many ways, Constance was the only member of the family who adapted successfully to the modern age. She understood that survival required withdrawal, not relevance, by stepping out of history's spotlight. She avoided its judgment. Her life became quiet by design, and that quiet was radical. A family outpaced by time. As the 1930s progressed, it became clear that the Cornwallis West family no longer belonged to the present. They had been shaped by a world that valued discretion over transparency, lineage over merit, and influence over accountability. That world was dying, replaced by mass politics, ideological conflict, and total war, when the Second World War arrived. It did not create new wounds for the family. It merely exposed how little remained. Daisy would die in 1943, in a Europe unrecognizable from the one she had once dazzled. George would follow years later, in a final act of control that spoke volumes about his lifelong struggle. Constance would endure, quietly outliving them all. The Cornwallis West story was no longer about ascent or scandal. It had become a study in aftermath. What happens after power fades, after access closes, after ambition outlives its usefulness? The answer, slowly and unceremoniously, was becoming clear. The world does not mourn fallen aristocracies. It simply moves on. By the time Europe was consumed by the Second World War, the Cornwallis West family had already slipped into the margins of history. They were no longer dangerous, no longer influential, no longer watched. And for a family that had once lived on attention, royal favor, gossip, proximity to power, that invisibility was its own kind of ending. Daisy's last years. Daisy Cornwallis West, once Princess of Pless, spent her final years in a Europe that barely resembled the one she had entered as a young bride. The castles remained, but their meaning had changed. Grandeur felt hollow in a continent fractured by ideology and violence. Borders shifted, titles lost relevance. The industrial wealth that had once made families like the Hochbergs untouchable became a liability, attracting suspicion rather than admiration. Daisy, aging and increasingly frail, lived largely withdrawn. Her memoirs had secured her a strange form of immortality. She was remembered, quoted, discussed, but that public presence did not translate into companionship. Her sons lived their own lives, shaped by their father's rigidity and their mother's absence. When Daisy died in 1943, at the age of 70, her passing went largely unnoticed outside a narrow circle. Europe was burning. Millions were dying. There was little room for nostalgia about a fallen aristocratic princess. And yet, her writings endured. They remained as quiet indictments of a system that had promised women everything except autonomy. Daisy had entered history as an object of fascination. She left it as a voice, one that refused to romanticize the world that had shaped her. George's final isolation for George Cornwallis West. The post-war years offered no renewal, only narrowing horizons. The death of his wife Stella Campbell in 1940 removed the last stabilizing presence in his life. What remained was illness, memory, and regret. Parkinson's disease advanced steadily, stripping away independence and dignity. Simple tasks became burdens. Conversation grew difficult. The world, once so overwhelming, receded. George's life had always been defined by imbalance between privilege and purpose, affection and abandonment. Now, even distraction was gone. Friends noted his increasing preoccupation with death, not in a melodramatic way, but with the quiet finality of someone who felt finished. He spoke of planning, of order, of choosing an ending rather than enduring decline. On April 1, 1951, George acted. He was 76 years old. Those closest to him believed the date was intentional. April Fool's Day, a final. Bitter commentary on a life that had never quite aligned with expectation. His suicide was calm, deliberate, and unmistakably planned. There was no scandal in his death, only sadness. The man who had once stood at the intersection of royalty, theater, and politics passed quietly. Another aristocratic figure erased by time rather than condemned by it. Constance alone. When George died. Constance Cornwallis West was already old, but still present. She had outlived not only her siblings, but the world that had defined their youth. Her second marriage to John Fitzpatrick Lewis remained her anchor. Their life together, modest by aristocratic standards, was stable and emotionally intact. Constance did not write memoirs. She did not grant interviews. She did not defend her family. Silence was her legacy. She lived through the 20th century's most violent transformations without inserting herself into the narrative. While others attempted to shape how history would remember them, Constance accepted anonymity as protection. Her children from her first marriage carried on quietly, detached from the excesses and scandals that had defined the Cornwallis West name. The family line did not disappear, but it diluted, merging into a world where aristocratic identity mattered far less. By the time Constance died in 1970, at the age of 94, the Cornwallis West saga was no longer a living memory. It was history. What was left? When the dust settled, what remained of the Cornwallis West family was not a dynasty, but a pattern. A woman who grasped power through intimacy. Children elevated beyond stability. Marriages that traded affection for advantage. Lives defined more by management than meaning. They had touched the center of European power and survived. But survival was not victory. In the end, the Cornwallis West story did not conclude with triumph or punishment. It concluded with dissolution, a gradual dispersal into obscurity, where scandal softened into anecdote and influence faded into footnotes. And perhaps that was the most fitting ending of all, because the family had never truly owned power. They had borrowed it, briefly, dangerously, and at great cost. History, patient and indifferent, simply waited for it to be returned. By the time the last members of the Cornwallis West family faded from public life, something subtle but irreversible had taken place. Their scandals no longer shocked, their names no longer threatened, their stories no longer belonged to them. They had become material for historians, biographers, and audiences hungry to understand how power once worked when it was whispered rather than declared. What survived was not influence, but narrative. The children of excess. The next generation carried the family forward quietly. stripped of both the ambition and the danger that had defined Patsy Fitzpatrick's era. Titles still existed, money still existed, but the psychological intensity that once drove the Cornwallis West ascent was gone. Daisy's sons, Hans, Alexander, and Bolko, embodied this transition. Hans and Alexander lived long lives marked by restraint. They inherited wealth and status, but avoided spectacle. Neither left heirs. Their existence was orderly, controlled, and emotionally sealed, perhaps a reaction to the chaos of their parents' marriage. Bolko, by contrast, carried the unresolved volatility of the family. His life ended early, in 1936, clouded by the scandal of his marriage to Clotilde de Silva, his former stepmother. The union, legally permissible but socially repellent, produced children whose place within aristocratic lineage defied convention. It was the final grotesque echo of a family long entangled in moral ambiguity. When Bolko's son, Bolko Jr., inherited the title of Prince of Pless, it felt less like succession and more like obligation. The line continued, but without momentum. When Bolko Jr. died in 2022 without heirs, the title passed to another branch of the family, the Hochberg dynasty, once a symbol of industrial dominance, quietly fragmented. A name rewritten back in Britain. The Cornwallis West name lived on primarily through Constance's descendants. Her eldest daughter, Ursula, married William Patrick Filmer Sankey, ensuring the continuation of the bloodline, but not the mythology. No one in that generation attempted to reclaim the past. There were no grand memoirs, no public defenses, no efforts to resurrect relevance. The family learned, perhaps unconsciously, the lesson their predecessors never had, that survival in the modern world required distance from spectacle, not proximity to it. Ironically, the family's most enduring presence came not through power, but through culture. Daisy's memoirs remained in circulation. George's life intersected perpetually with that of Winston Churchill. Patsy Fitzpatrick appeared again and again in historical footnotes as the woman who had once been too close to a king. They were remembered, but selectively. History sanded down complexity into archetype. Patsy became the mistress. Daisy became the beauty. George became the tragic son. Constance became the survivor. None of those labels were false. None of them were complete. What the story reveals taken together. The Cornwallis West saga reveals something uncomfortable about aristocratic power. It was never stable. It was never moral. And it was never designed to last. Power flowed through intimacy, secrecy, and silence. It rewarded discretion and punished visibility. Women accessed it indirectly and paid for that access disproportionately. Men inherited it and often wasted it. The family did not fall because of scandal. Scandal was simply the evidence of a system already unsound by the mid-20th century. That system had collapsed entirely. Democracy expanded, media sharpened, privacy evaporated. The old rules, once enforced through whispers and marriages, lost authority. The Cornwallis West family did not fail to adapt because they were foolish. They failed because the world no longer needed what they represented. The quiet ending. There was no final catastrophe, no dramatic reckoning, no moment when history slammed the door. Instead, the story ended the way most aristocratic stories do, quietly, unevenly, and without ceremony. People moved on. Names softened into anecdotes. Scandals became trivia. And yet, beneath that quiet ending lies the reason the story still fascinates. Because the Cornwallis West family lived at the exact intersection where private desire met public power, and where the cost of crossing that boundary was paid not immediately, but generationally. They remind us that proximity to power is not the same as possessing it, and that sometimes the most dangerous legacy a family can leave behind is not wealth or title, but a hunger for significance that no inheritance can ever satisfy. Long after the last Cornwallis West had stopped breathing, their reputation continued to live a life of its own. This is the peculiar cruelty of history. People die, but stories do not. By the mid-20th century, no one feared the Cornwallis West family anymore. No one sought their favor. No one worried about offending them. Yet their names still surfaced, again and again, in biographies, footnotes, letters, and half-remembered scandals whispered by historians who knew exactly where to look. The family had crossed a threshold few dynasties ever managed to cross. They had become interesting, from power to curiosity in their prime. The Cornwallis West name functioned as a key, unlocking drawing rooms, royal introductions, and marriages that altered bloodlines across Europe. After their fall, the name transformed into something else entirely, a case study. They were no longer cited as examples of prestige, but of proximity. How close one family could come to the center of power without ever fully belonging to it. Biographers of King Edward VII lingered on Patsy Fitzpatrick not because she was unique, but because she was revealing through her. Historians glimpsed how the monarchy managed desire, discretion, and damage. Patsy was not remembered as a lover, but as a liability that had been skillfully absorbed and redirected. That redirection into marriage, into children, into silence, became the template by which many later scandals were understood. The crown did not eliminate problems, it reassigned them, and William Cornwallis West, whether willingly or not, had played the role of absorber perfectly. Daisy rewritten. Daisy Cornwallis West experienced a stranger fate during her lifetime. She had been seen primarily as an object, admired, envied, criticized, photographed, after her death. She was reclaimed as a voice. Her memoirs, once dismissed as indiscreet, were reevaluated by later generations who recognized their value as social documentation. What Daisy recorded was not gossip. It was structure. She described how women were exchanged between families, how infidelity functioned as currency, how appearances were enforced through exhaustion rather than violence. Her tone, measured, unsentimental, felt increasingly modern as the 20th century progressed. Historians no longer asked whether Daisy had been happy. They asked whether she had been honest, and the answer, uncomfortably, was yes. George, as warning. George Cornwallis West was remembered least kindly, where Daisy became a commentator and Patsy a symbol. George became a cautionary tale. Biographers of Winston Churchill mentioned him almost reluctantly, an oddity in the margins of greatness. The stepfather who was technically older than his stepson, the aristocrat who had everything and produced nothing lasting. His suicide in 1951 sealed that narrative. George came to represent the danger of inherited privilege without grounding, of identity built on rumor rather than achievement. Where his ancestors had been defined by action, George was defined by reaction. He had lived downstream from secrets he could never confirm and expectations he could never satisfy. History judged him harshly, but perhaps accurately. Constance disappears. And then there was Constance Cornwallis West. Or rather, there wasn't. Constance achieved something almost unheard of in aristocratic memory. She vanished without erasure. No scandals clung to her. No books obsessed over her choices. No historians argued over her motivations. She appeared only where necessary, and nowhere else, to later scholars. Constance became proof that survival within power structures required not brilliance, but withdrawal. She was not the most fascinating member of her family, but she was the most intact. Her silence became its own form of authorship, what the family ultimately represented taken together. The Cornwallis West family came to represent a transitional moment in Western power. They belonged to a world where power flowed through intimacy. Reputation mattered more than legality. Women accessed influence sideways. Men inherited authority they did not always deserve, and when that world collapsed, they collapsed with it, not violently, but inevitably. The family did not fall because they were immoral. They fell because the system that rewarded their behavior no longer existed. The final irony. The greatest irony of the Cornwallis West story is this. They were never truly powerful, yet they were close enough to power to be destroyed by it. They did not rule. They did not decide policy. They did not command armies. But they lived in the gravitational field of those who did. And gravity, over time, leaves marks long after their estates were sold, their titles diluted, and their descendants dispersed into ordinary lives. The Cornwallis West family remained embedded in history, not as leaders, but as evidence of how power once worked, evidence of who paid the price for it, evidence that proximity can be more dangerous than possession, and as historians continued to return to their story, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. The Cornwallis West family did not fail to control power. They failed to escape it. The reckoning was complete. As the 20th century advanced, something quietly radical happened to stories like that of the Cornwallis West family. They stopped being told with admiration. Instead, they were examined. The rise of modern journalism, academic history, and cultural criticism transformed aristocratic scandal from entertainment into evidence. What had once been whispered behind velvet curtains was now analyzed in print, stripped of glamour and placed within systems of power, gender, and control. And under that light, the Cornwallis West story looked very different. The end of discretion. For centuries, aristocratic power had relied on one essential condition: privacy. Mistresses were managed. Illegitimate children were absorbed. Financial ruin was disguised as dignity. As long as discretion held, the system functioned. But discretion did not survive the modern age. By the mid-20th century, the mechanisms that had protected families like the Cornwallis Wests, royal favor, social silence, press compliance, were gone. Newspapers no longer deferred. Biographers no longer softened. Courts no longer looked away. What had once been survivable behavior became indefensible behavior. Under this new scrutiny, Patsy Fitzpatrick's life stopped being framed as scandalous misbehavior and started being understood as structural exploitation. A teenage girl involved with the future king, a forced marriage to contain royal embarrassment, a lifetime of power exercised indirectly and punished directly. Her story was no longer exceptional, it was representative. Historians began to ask questions Victorian society never had. Who benefited from silence? Who paid for discretion? And who decided when scandal was forgivable? The answers were no longer flattering. Women as infrastructure. One of the most striking reinterpretations of the Cornwallis West saga centered on the role of women, not as individuals, but as infrastructure. Patsy was infrastructure. Daisy was infrastructure. Constance, in her own way, was infrastructure. They were not merely wives or daughters. They were mechanisms through which alliances were built, reputations stabilized, and power transferred without formal acknowledgement. When those mechanisms malfunctioned, women bore the blame. Men were indulgent. Women were dangerous. The double standard, once invisible, became impossible to ignore. Daisy's memoirs, reread through a modern lens, felt less like indiscretion and more like testimony. Her descriptions of emotional isolation, marital coercion, and enforced performance echoed experiences that later generations of women recognized immediately. She had not exaggerated. She had simply spoken too early. Men without consequence. The men in the Cornwallis West story aged poorly in historical memory. Prince Edward, later King Edward VII, remained largely insulated. His reputation survived with minimal damage. Softened by nostalgia and national myth-making, his indulgences were reframed as charm. William Cornwallis West was remembered as dutiful but forgettable, a man who absorbed scandal without question and vanished into respectability. Hans Heinrich von Hochberg became a case study in aristocratic excess. Wealth without restraint, power without accountability. And George Cornwallis West emerged as the most tragic figure, not because he caused the most harm, but because he embodied the long-term psychological cost of growing up inside unresolved secrets. The system protected men from immediate consequence. It did not protect them from erosion. The collapse of the model. By the time historians revisited the Cornwallis West family in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the aristocratic model that had shaped their lives no longer existed. Marriage was no longer primarily transactional. Illegitimacy no longer carried automatic ruin. Women no longer required male intermediaries to access public voice. What had once felt inevitable now looked constructed and fragile. The Cornwallis West family had not been cursed. They had been optimized for a system that collapsed. Every strategic marriage, every silenced rumor, every discreet arrangement had been designed for a world that valued stability over truth. When that value inverted, the family's adaptations became liabilities. They had learned how to survive secrecy. They had not learned how to survive transparency. Why the story still matters. What gives the Cornwallis West story its lasting power is not scandal, but recognition. Modern audiences do not listen because they envy the family's proximity to royalty. They listen because they recognize the patterns. Power hidden as intimacy. Control disguised as care. Silence framed as protection. Women blamed for systems they did not design. The story feels contemporary because it is. The details have changed. The mechanisms have not. When people return to the Cornwallis West saga now, they are not asking, how scandalous were they? They are asking something far more unsettling. How many families survived exactly like this and were never recorded? The answer is uncomfortable. Most of them, the Cornwallis Wests, are remembered not because they were unique, but because their proximity to royalty preserved the record. Their mistakes were documented. Their suffering was archived. Their contradictions were visible. Countless others lived the same dynamics without names history cared to save. The turning point. This realization marks the true turning point of the story. The Cornwallis West family ceases to be a subject of gossip and becomes a mirror, not of aristocracy alone, but of any system that prioritizes appearance over accountability. Their story teaches a final, sobering lesson. Power does not need to be cruel to be destructive. It only needs to be opaque. And once opacity disappears, everything built upon it must either transform or collapse. The Cornwallis West family did not survive that transformation, but their story did. And in surviving, it exposes the system that created them far more clearly than any scandal ever could. The final chapter is not about what they lost. It is about what the world learned, too late for them, but not too late for everyone else. There is a persistent myth about power, that proximity to it is safety. The story of the Cornwallis West family proves the opposite. They did not rule. They did not command armies. They did not sign laws. But they lived close enough to power that its consequences reached them first and lingered longest. Living in the shadow of the crown, from the moment Patsy Fitzpatrick became involved with the future King Edward VII, the Cornwallis West family entered a dangerous space, the shadow of the crown. It was a place where favors existed without guarantees, where protection came without permanence, and where silence was demanded without reward. Proximity to power offered opportunity, but never ownership. When things went well, the family benefited enormously. Doors opened, alliances formed, marriages were arranged across borders and dynasties. Wealth flowed inward, titles accumulated. But when things went wrong, the same proximity became a liability. The monarchy could absorb scandal. The aristocracy could redirect it. Families like the Cornwallis Wests had nowhere to send it. They became buffers, living shock absorbers between power and consequence, the invisible contract. Unwritten contracts governed this world. The powerful would indulge themselves. The connected would manage the fallout. The vulnerable would be sacrificed if necessary. Patsy understood this contract intuitively. She navigated it with precision, securing futures for her children at the cost of her own reputation. She accepted ostracism because she believed results would justify the price. In that sense, she succeeded, but the contract had a clause she did not control. Duration. Protection was temporary. Access was conditional. Memory was unforgiving. Once her usefulness ended, once the crown no longer required her discretion, she was discarded. Not violently, not publicly, simply ignored. And in aristocratic society, irrelevance was the most complete form of erasure. Generational consequences. The children paid different prices for the same bargain. Daisy paid with intimacy. She gained castles and titles but lost agency, companionship, and belonging. Her reward was visibility without control. George paid with identity. Raised under rumors he could neither confirm nor escape. He spent his life searching for grounding that proximity to power could never provide. Constance paid least and learned most. She recognized early that survival required disengagement. She took what was necessary and withdrew before the cost escalated. Each outcome traced back to the same source. Power accessed indirectly is never neutral. It demands adaptation. It reshapes psychology. It rarely leaves people whole. Why proximity is more dangerous than authority. Authority comes with rules, accountability, and limits, even if imperfectly enforced. Proximity comes with none of those. Those near power must anticipate its needs, interpret its moods, and absorb its consequences. They operate without clarity, without protection, and without recourse. The Cornwallis Wests lived in that space. They did not break laws. They did not challenge institutions. They simply existed too close to forces that did not care whether they survived. And when history moved on, those forces left them behind without hesitation. The illusion of influence. Perhaps the most enduring misconception about the Cornwallis West family is that they were influential. They were not. They were useful. Usefulness is not power. It is a temporary condition. Once usefulness expires, there is no legacy, only residue. That residue took the form of scandal, tragedy, memoir, and silence. It left behind records, but not continuity. Stories, but not structures. The family gained access, but never authority. They gained visibility, but never control. And visibility without control is exposure. What the story ultimately warns us about. The Cornwallis West saga is not a warning about immorality, ambition, or scandal. It is a warning about misunderstanding power. True power is durable. Borrowed power is expensive. The family believed, understandably, that closeness to the crown meant safety. That royal favor could be transformed into permanence. That influence, once achieved, could be maintained. They were wrong. Power did not protect them. It used them, and when they were no longer useful, it moved on, leaving them to absorb the long-term damage alone. The quiet lesson. There is no dramatic ending to this realization. No moment of revelation, no final confrontation. Only distance. Distance between what the family believed power to be and what it actually was. The Cornwallis Wests did not lose power. They discovered they had never possessed it. What they had possessed was access, fleeting, conditional, and ultimately corrosive. And in that discovery lies the final lesson of their story. Being close to power can cost more than being powerless. Because when power collapses, or simply shifts, it does not take responsibility for those it leaves behind. It never has. It never will. When the Cornwallis West story passed into its later generations, something essential was missing. There was no ambition left to inherit. The children and grandchildren who followed did not grow up dreaming of proximity to kings, of shaping marriages across borders, or of bending society through intimacy and discretion. What they inherited instead was far quieter and far heavier, memory without instruction. A legacy without a map. For earlier generations, the rules had been clear. Even if they were cruel, power could be accessed, scandal could be managed, silence could be weaponized. But by the time the next generation came of age, those rules had dissolved. The aristocratic world no longer explained itself. Titles still existed, but they no longer guaranteed relevance. Wealth still mattered, but it no longer protected reputation. History had moved from salons into courtrooms and newspapers, and the Cornwallis West descendants felt this shift instinctively. They did not ask how to rise. They asked how to avoid falling. This was especially true among the descendants of Constance Cornwallis West, whose children and grandchildren grew up watching her deliberate withdrawal from spectacle. Constance did not frame her choices as moral lessons, but her life itself became one. Do not attract attention. Do not trade intimacy for leverage. Do not confuse proximity with safety. Her descendants absorbed this code without ever hearing it spoken aloud. The Hochberg line, continuation without center on the continental side of the family. The Hochberg lineage continued, but hollowed. After the death of Bolko von Hochberg in 1936, amid the lingering scandal of his marriage to his former stepmother, Clotilde de Silva, the title of Prince of Pless passed to his son, Bolko Jr. The succession was legal, orderly, and utterly devoid of triumph. By then, the world that had made Pless Castle meaningful was gone. Industrial wealth no longer guaranteed political influence. Aristocratic titles had become ceremonial, and the moral confusion surrounding the Hochberg family had permanently stained their name. Bolko Jr. inherited a title, but not a role. He did not command loyalty. He did not shape policy. He did not anchor a dynasty. When he died in 2022 without heirs, the title passed laterally to another branch of the family. The line technically survived, but its symbolic center vanished. What had once been a gravitational force became an administrative detail. British descendants, choosing normalcy. In Britain, the Cornwallis West bloodline persisted through quieter channels. Ursula, Constance's eldest daughter, married William Patrick Filmer Sankey, ensuring that the family did not disappear entirely. Their descendants lived lives that would have baffled earlier generations, professional, private, largely detached from aristocratic ritual. They did not trade on their ancestry. They did not write memoirs. They did not correct the historical record. Their relationship to the past was passive. The Cornwallis West name became something to explain briefly, if at all, an interesting footnote rather than an identity. This was not rejection. It was fatigue. Generations raised amid scandal do not seek drama. They seek stability. And stability, in the modern world, required something radical by aristocratic standards. Anonymity. What was lost, and what was gained, in stepping away from the patterns that had defined their ancestors. The later Cornwallis West generations lost certain things. They lost visibility. They lost influence. They lost historical momentum. But they gained something their predecessors never had. They gained choice. Choice to live without being watched. Choice to form relationships without strategic consequence. Choice to fail privately instead of publicly. The family's survival strategy evolved, not through adaptation within power, but through disengagement from it. And in that evolution lies a quiet truth. The Cornwallis West story did not end because the family line ended. It ended because the family finally learned how to stop performing. The weight that remained. Yet even as the descendants moved on, something lingered. History had already frozen the earlier generations in place. Patsy as the mistress, Daisy as the beauty, George as the tragic figure, Constance as the survivor. Those images did not fade simply because the family chose silence. They became public property. And with that came an inevitable tension. The distance between who the family once was and who their descendants were allowed to be. The later generations inherited no guilt for the past, but they inherited its narrative gravity. The story followed them, even if they refused to carry it forward. In this way, the Cornwallis West legacy achieved its final form. Not a dynasty, not a scandal, but a cautionary archive. A reminder that some stories end not with extinction, but with exhaustion, and that sometimes the most powerful inheritance a family can claim is the decision to let history stop speaking through them. For the later descendants of the Cornwallis West family, history was not something they experienced. It was something that followed them. By the late 20th century, the family's most dramatic chapters had hardened into narrative. The people involved were no longer individuals with contradictions and private motives. They were characters, fixed, interpreted, quoted, and for those who came after. This created a strange inheritance, a past that was famous, but no longer useful. When history becomes identity. Unlike earlier generations, the Cornwallis West descendants did not grow up inside the machinery of aristocratic power. They were not raised to negotiate marriages, manage scandal, or navigate royal favor. They were raised in a world where such systems were already obsolete. Yet the story remained. Teachers mentioned it. Biographers referenced it, occasionally. Journalists resurfaced it. The family name triggered curiosity, not deference, and curiosity can be invasive in its own way. Descendants learned early that their ancestry invited assumptions, that people expected decadence, eccentricity, or drama, that a famous past created pressure to either live up to it or actively disown it. Most chose neither. They chose neutrality. They did not deny their lineage. They did not emphasize it. They treated it as background noise. This was not indifference. It was self-preservation. The burden of simplified stories. What made the situation more difficult was not the notoriety itself, but the simplification of it. History, especially popular history, does not tolerate complexity well. It prefers symbols. Patsy became the mistress. Daisy became the glamorous princess. George became the tragic aristocrat. Constance became the quiet exception. These versions were easier to remember, but they erased nuance. Descendants knew, at least intuitively, that these simplified portraits were incomplete, but correcting them would require engagement, and engagement would mean reopening a story that had already cost the family generations of peace. So they let the simplifications stand. Silence became the final editorial decision, choosing private lives. What distinguished the Cornwallis West descendants from their ancestors was not moral superiority, but strategic restraint. They watched what visibility had done to earlier generations, how it invited judgment, distorted relationships, and reduced lives to spectacle. And they understood something essential. Visibility is not power, it is vulnerability. So they chose professions that offered privacy rather than prestige. They built families away from public interest. They allowed the family name to fade into genealogy rather than headline. In doing so, they reversed a century-long pattern where Patsy had pushed relentlessly toward relevance. Her descendants moved deliberately toward obscurity, and obscurity, once feared, became a form of freedom. The emotional distance from the past, this distance, however, came at a cost. To disengage from a famous past is to accept that part of one's story will always belong to others. Historians would continue to interpret, writers would continue to dramatize, audiences would continue to consume. The family would not be asked for permission. This required a kind of emotional discipline. Descendants learned not to personalize public narratives. They understood that history's version of their ancestors was not meant to be fair. It was meant to be coherent, and coherence often requires sacrifice. They let history keep its simplified versions. In return, they kept their lives. A different definition of success. By modern standards, the Cornwallis West descendants might seem unremarkable. No great fortunes, no political dominance, no cultural authority. But that ordinariness was deliberate. In choosing stability over spectacle, they achieved something earlier generations never could: continuity without crisis. Families shaped by power often burn out quickly. They rise fast, consume themselves, and disappear. The Cornwallis Wests avoided extinction not through dominance, but through retreat. They survived by becoming normal. And in that normalcy lies the most radical transformation of all. The story no longer belongs to them. At some point, every famous family confronts the same truth. The story outgrows the bloodline by the late 20th century. The Cornwallis West saga no longer belonged to the people carrying the name. It belonged to historians, readers, and audiences searching for meaning in the past. The descendants understood this and stepped aside. They did not fight for narrative control. They did not attempt rebranding. They did not seek redemption arcs. They allowed the story to end where history had already placed it. What remains? What remains of the Cornwallis West family today is not a dynasty, but a lesson embedded in lineage, a lesson about how power operates when it is hidden, about how families are reshaped by secrets they did not choose, about how survival sometimes requires refusal rather than ambition. The descendants live with a famous past, but they are not ruled by it. And perhaps that is the final, quiet victory of the Cornwallis West story. Not that it is remembered, but that it no longer needs to be lived. Every powerful family believes its story will end in triumph or disaster. The Cornwallis West family ended in something far less dramatic and far more decisive: silence. Not imposed silence, not censored silence, but chosen silence. By the late 20th century, there were no Cornwallis Wests left who needed to explain themselves to history. No one was arranging marriages. No one was negotiating reputations. No one was standing close enough to power to be burned by it. The cycle had finally broken. When the pattern becomes visible, what separated the final generations from those who came before was awareness. Earlier members of the family lived inside the system. They accepted its logic as natural, that intimacy could be exchanged for security, that discretion was protection, that proximity to power was destiny. The later generations saw the pattern whole. They could trace it backward. A teenage girl absorbed into royal secrecy. A marriage built to contain scandal. Children elevated beyond emotional stability. A family sustained by access, not authority. Lives fractured once access disappeared. Seen clearly, the pattern lost its glamour. It no longer looked like privilege. It looked like exposure. And exposure, once recognized, loses its seductive pull. Refusing to inherit the role. Families shaped by power often pass down more than names and bloodlines. They pass down roles. The Cornwallis Wests had played specific roles for generations. The convenient husband, the beautiful intermediary, the charming distraction, the silent survivor. What ended the family's internal cycle was not tragedy, but refusal. The later generations declined to perform. They did not become intermediaries. They did not leverage intimacy. They did not trade privacy for relevance. They understood that the family's historic usefulness had depended on being available to monarchs, to gossip, to systems that demanded emotional labor without offering security. Availability was the trap, so they withdrew it. Silence as an act of agency in historical narratives. Silence is often framed as weakness. In this case, it was agency, by choosing not to engage with their own mythology. The descendants did something their ancestors never could. They denied power the opportunity to use them. They did not correct the record because correction would require participation. They did not defend reputations because defense would reopen negotiations. They did not monetize history because monetization would invite ownership disputes. They let the story stand, unfinished, imperfect, and no longer actionable. This was not resignation. It was closure. What the Cornwallis West story ultimately teaches when viewed as a whole. The Cornwallis West saga offers a rare, complete arc. Not the rise and fall of a dynasty, but the dissolution of a strategy. A strategy based on indirect access, managed scandal, emotional leverage, silence as currency. That strategy worked, for a time. It produced wealth, it produced marriages, it produced visibility, but it also produced instability, psychological damage, and generational exhaustion. The final lesson is not moral, it is structural. Systems that rely on secrecy eventually collapse, not because secrets are revealed, but because maintaining them becomes unsustainable. The Cornwallis Wests did not lose power. They outlived the conditions that made their power intelligible. The end without applause. There was no moment when the family declared an end to its legacy. No ceremony, no reckoning. The ending arrived quietly, through choices that did not look dramatic in isolation. Choosing privacy over prestige, choosing ordinary professions, choosing emotional safety over relevance, choosing to let history speak without interruption. These choices accumulated, and accumulation, not catastrophe, is how cycles truly end. The final meaning. The Cornwallis West family began as a case study in proximity to power. It ended as a case study in exit. They showed, across generations, what happens when people live too close to systems that do not belong to them, and what happens when those systems are finally left behind. Their story remains compelling not because of scandal, but because of resolution. Not the resolution of justice, not the resolution of redemption, but the resolution of distance. Power no longer needed them, and they no longer needed power. That mutual disengagement is rare in history, and it is the quietest kind of ending a powerful story can have. Every long story reaches a moment when explanation is no longer enough. For the Cornwallis West family, that moment arrived not with a scandal, a death, or a public disgrace, but with clarity. Clarity is more dangerous than revelation. Revelation shocks. Clarity rearranges meaning. By the time historians, biographers, and modern audiences revisited the Cornwallis West saga in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the illusion that once surrounded aristocratic life could no longer be sustained. The glamour did not hold, the excuses did not persuade. The myth of inherited stability collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was structure. The machinery behind the myth. The Cornwallis West family had never been exceptional because of personality. They were exceptional because of placement. They existed at a precise intersection. Close enough to royalty to matter. Far enough from authority to be expendable. This position created the illusion of power without its protections. Patsy Fitzpatrick mistook access for leverage. Daisy mistook visibility for value. George mistook privilege for identity. Only Constance, intuitively and early, understood the truth. Power without ownership is risk. Once that truth becomes visible, the entire story shifts. What looked like personal failure becomes systemic exposure. Reframing Patsy. In earlier tellings, Patsy Fitzpatrick was framed as reckless, manipulative, even predatory. But clarity demands context. She was a teenage girl involved with the future king in a system that offered her no legal agency and no public voice. When discovery threatened, she was not protected. She was reassigned, married off to contain royal embarrassment, absorbed into respectability without consent. Her later actions, her relentless ambition, her emotional risk-taking, her refusal to retreat, were not anomalies. They were the predictable outcomes of a woman taught that proximity was her only currency. She did not break the system. She revealed it. Daisy reconsidered Daisy Cornwallis West, long remembered for beauty and excess, emerges differently under clarity. Her marriage to Hans Heinrich von Hochberg was not a fairy tale corrupted by personal weakness. It was a contractual arrangement between declining English aristocracy and rising continental industrial power. Daisy was not naive. She was untrained. She entered a world that demanded performance without offering reciprocity. Her infidelities were not rebellion, they were symptoms. Her diaries were not indiscretions, they were survival mechanisms. When Daisy later wrote her memoirs, she was not seeking revenge or notoriety. She was correcting the record in the only way available to her. She was not exposing scandal. She was exposing loneliness. George. Without myth. George Cornwallis West's tragedy has often been framed as personal weakness, a man who squandered privilege and collapsed under indulgence. Clarity complicates that judgment. George grew up under unresolved rumors about his parentage. Raised by a father who embodied restraint and a mother who embodied manipulation, he inherited expectations without instruction, status without grounding. His relationships with older women were not transgressions. They were searches for authority, affirmation, and belonging. His financial failures were not recklessness alone. They were expressions of a man never taught how to anchor himself outside inherited structures. George did not fail because he lacked discipline. He failed because he was never allowed a stable identity. The family as evidence seen clearly. The Cornwallis West family becomes less a collection of dramatic individuals and more a single data point, a visible example of how aristocratic systems distributed risk. The crown absorbed pleasure. The aristocracy absorbed scandal. Peripheral families absorbed damage, and the damage was cumulative. It expressed itself as emotional instability, fragmented marriages, identity confusion, generational exhaustion. None of this was accidental. It was functional. Why the illusion matters. The illusion of aristocratic power persists because it flatters those who consume it. It promises elegance, continuity, and control. The Cornwallis West story dismantles that illusion. It shows a world where control was performative, stability was staged, intimacy was transactional, silence was enforced. Once this is understood, the story loses its romance, but gains its relevance. Modern audiences do not listen because they envy the family's proximity to royalty. They listen because they recognize the pattern. The details have changed, the structures have not. The breaking point. Illusions survive as long as no one asks the wrong questions. The Cornwallis West saga reached its breaking point not when scandals emerged, but when explanations stopped working. When it became impossible to say, that was just how things were. They should have known better. It was a different time. Clarity replaces excuse, and clarity, once achieved, cannot be reversed. The illusion did not shatter in one moment. It dissolved, and in that dissolution lies the beginning of the final act, not of the family's story, but of its meaning, because once illusion is gone, what remains is not judgment, but understanding. And understanding changes everything. Once the illusion is gone, a harder question remains. Not how the Cornwallis West family lived so close to power, but what that closeness extracted in return. Because power never takes payment up front. It collects slowly, invisibly, and across generations. The myth of the lucky family. From the outside, the Cornwallis Wests looked fortunate. They married well. They lived grandly. They circulated among royalty and industrial elites. History often frames such families as beneficiaries of privilege, as people who won the social lottery. But that framing misses the transaction. Privilege is not a gift. It is an exchange. And the currency demanded is rarely money, emotional labor as payment. What the Cornwallis West family paid, repeatedly, was emotional labor. Patsy paid with her reputation. She absorbed shame so the crown would not have to. She carried the moral burden of a system that needed her discretion more than her dignity. Daisy paid with intimacy. She was required to be charming, desirable, adaptable, yet never demanding. Her loneliness was not accidental. It was structurally produced. George paid with identity, raised inside ambiguity. He was expected to perform confidence without certainty, masculinity without grounding. The rumors around his birth were not gossip. They were unresolved debts passed down to him. Constance paid the least because she paid early. She limited exposure. She exited before the emotional cost compounded. These were not individual failures. They were fees. Why power prefers intermediaries. One of the least discussed truths about power is this. Power prefers not to touch consequence directly. It operates through buffers, people close enough to absorb fallout, distant enough to be discarded. Families like the Cornwallis Wests functioned as such buffers. They handled awkward relationships, uncomfortable timelines, social contradictions, moral ambiguity. In return, they received access, but not security. This arrangement benefits power immensely. It creates deniability. It externalizes damage. It preserves authority. And when the intermediaries break, power remains intact. The gendered cost. The cost was not distributed evenly. Women paid more. Patsy's sexuality became a public issue. Edward's did not. Daisy's infidelity became gossip. Hans's was expectation. Constance's divorce was scandalous. Hugh Grosvenor's emotional absence was not. This imbalance was not hypocrisy. It was design. The system required women to be flexible, absorptive, and silent. When they were not, they became the problem the system claimed to correct. The Cornwallis West women did not break norms. They exposed them. Why wealth didn't save them. It is tempting to assume that money compensates for these costs. It does not. Wealth can cushion logistics. It cannot repair psychological damage. Daisy lived in castles and felt trapped. George never lacked resources and still felt untethered. Patsy maneuvered among elites and died isolated. The family's decline was not financial. It was internal. Power's long memory. Another illusion shattered by the Cornwallis West story is that time neutralizes cost. It does not. Power has a long memory, but only for those beneath it. The consequences of Patsy's early involvement with Edward echoed decades later in George's instability and Daisy's exile. The system moved on, but the damage stayed where it landed. This is how power protects itself. It advances. Others carry the residue. Why? This still resonates. Modern audiences recognize this dynamic instantly. They see it in corporations that outsource risk, in politics that deflect accountability, in families that trade proximity for protection. The Cornwallis West story feels current because the structure remains familiar. Only the costumes have changed. The uncomfortable truth. The most uncomfortable truth this story reveals is not that power corrupts. It is that power consumes. And it consumes most efficiently those who believe closeness is safety. The Cornwallis Wests were not naive. They were pragmatic. They made the best choices available within the rules they were given. The tragedy is that the rules themselves were designed to ensure someone else paid the price. Where this leaves us. Once this cost is understood, the story can no longer be enjoyed as scandal alone. It becomes diagnostic. It shows how systems preserve themselves by distributing harm downward and outward, away from the center. Toward those just close enough to matter, the Cornwallis West family paid what power required in return. They received access without protection, visibility without control, and legacy without peace. And that exchange, once recognized, reframes everything that came before. What remains is not condemnation, but comprehension. And comprehension is where the story now moves, because once we understand the cost of power, the final question becomes unavoidable. Who is still paying it today? By the time the Cornwallis West story reached its final phase, nothing dramatic was left to happen. No fortunes remained to be won. No reputations were left to destroy. No alliances waited to be negotiated. What remained was inheritance, not of wealth or title, but of meaning. And meaning, unlike money, cannot be refused. What survives after power leaves. When families live close to power for too long, they leave behind a particular kind of residue. Not trauma in the clinical sense, not scandal in the public sense, but a quiet internal knowledge that closeness once required something to be surrendered. The Cornwallis West descendants inherited that knowledge without context. They did not experience the royal dinners, the discreet favors, or the dangerous silences firsthand. But they lived with the after effects, the instinctive caution, the avoidance of visibility, the mistrust of prestige. They learned, without being taught, that attention is not neutral. This was the true inheritance. History as a third parent. In most families, children grow up negotiating the influence of two parents. In this family, there was a third presence. History. History remembered what individuals tried to forget. It flattened complexity. It froze moments in time. Patsy was remembered for transgression, not strategy. Daisy for beauty, not perception. George for collapse, not confusion. Constance for survival, not calculation. These narratives followed the family long after the people themselves were gone, and the descendants understood something crucial. To argue with history is to re-enter it. So they did not argue. They accepted that the story would exist without their consent, and chose not to become characters within it. The quiet refusal. This refusal was subtle but decisive. No foundations were established in the family's name. No curated archives were released to set the record straight. No spokesperson emerged to reinterpret the past. Silence was not avoidance. It was boundary setting. The family chose not to extract value from their own mythology. In doing so, they ended the final transaction power had offered them: relevance in exchange for exposure. What the Cornwallis West story ultimately leaves us with when stripped of spectacle. The Cornwallis West saga leaves behind a single, unsettling insight. Power does not only shape outcomes, it shapes behavior long after it is gone. The family's later generations did not fear power. They did not resent it. They simply did not trust it. That distrust was earned. A story that outgrew its subjects. At some point, the story stopped belonging to the family entirely. It became a framework for understanding how institutions protect themselves, how individuals absorb systemic cost, how women's lives are often used as connective tissue, how silence can function as both harm and defense. The Cornwallis Wests are remembered not because they ruled, but because they reveal how rule was sustained. They show us the underside of continuity, the final shift. In the end, the family did something rare. They did not seek redemption. They did not seek vindication. They did not seek reinterpretation. They stepped away, and by stepping away, they allowed the story to become what it always wanted to be. Not a tale of scandal, but a lesson. A lesson about how systems operate quietly, about how cost is distributed unevenly, about how proximity can wound more deeply than distance. Where the story truly ends. The Cornwallis West story does not end with a death, a divorce, or a scandal. It ends with a choice repeated across generations: to live without being used as infrastructure for someone else's power. That choice does not erase the past. It does not correct history. But it does something more difficult. It stops the cycle. And in doing so, it leaves us with the most honest ending this story could have. Not triumph, not punishment, but understanding. Every story shaped by power eventually arrives at the same false expectation: that there will be redemption, a confession, an apology, a moral balance restored. The Cornwallis West family never received that ending, because history does not offer redemption to systems, only to individuals, and even then, only rarely. What this family reached instead was something colder, quieter, and far more unsettling: reckoning without forgiveness. When explanation is no longer enough. By the time the final generation stepped fully out of view, the question was no longer what happened. That had been answered. The real question became, what does it mean that this was allowed to happen at all? The forced marriage that silenced a teenage girl, the informal protections that shielded a king, the strategic unions that elevated children while hollowing them out, the silence that preserved institutions while corroding families. None of these acts violated the laws of their time. That is precisely the problem. The Cornwallis West story exposes a truth many power structures depend on: that legality and morality rarely overlap when influence is involved. The absence of villains. One of the most disturbing aspects of this story is the lack of clear villains. Prince Edward behaved as powerful men were expected to behave. William Cornwallis West fulfilled his social role without protest. Aristocratic families arranged marriages according to established custom. Society punished deviation, not exploitation. Everyone followed the rules, and those rules still produced harm. This absence of obvious cruelty makes reckoning difficult. There is no single figure to condemn, no moment where everything went wrong. The damage accumulated not through violence, but through normalization. That is why the story resists redemption. Redemption requires wrongdoing that can be isolated. This wrongdoing was structural. Patsy, revisited, without judgment. At the center of that structure stands Patsy Fitzpatrick, not as a heroine, nor as a villain, but as a consequence. She was absorbed into power before she was old enough to consent meaningfully. She was reassigned through marriage when exposure threatened authority. She learned quickly that influence was available, but only indirectly, and only temporarily. Her later ruthlessness was not corruption, it was adaptation. And yet, adaptation did not protect her in the end. When she outlived her usefulness, she was discarded with moral outrage that ignored the system that created her. Reckoning does not ask us to absolve Patsy. It asks us to recognize why her choices were predictable. The children as evidence. Not exception, Daisy, George, and Constance are often remembered as individuals whose lives diverged sharply, but Reckoning reframes them as outcomes. Daisy internalized performance until it hollowed her. George internalized ambiguity until it destroyed him. Constance internalized caution until she escaped. None of these paths were random. They were responses to the same environment. The family did not fracture because of personality differences. It fractured because the system demanded different sacrifices from each child and offered no repair afterward. Why redemption never arrived. Redemption requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement requires responsibility, and responsibility threatens continuity. The institutions that benefited from the Cornwallis West family's silence, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the social order itself, never acknowledged their role because doing so would destabilize their legitimacy. So the reckoning could only occur outside the system, in memoirs, in biographies, in historical analysis, in the quiet choices of descendants who refused repetition. Reckoning happened not as correction, but as distance. What makes this story uncomfortable? Most historical scandals fade because they can be compartmentalized. This one cannot, because the Cornwallis West story does not accuse a person, it accuses a method. A method still recognizable today. Managing risk by outsourcing consequence. Preserving image through silence. Using private lives as infrastructure. Treating intimacy as leverage. That recognition unsettles modern audiences. Not because it is shocking, but because it is familiar. The point of no return. Episode 9 marks the point where the story can no longer offer consolation. There is no lesson that guarantees safety, no moral that prevents repetition, no closure that restores balance. There is only awareness. Awareness that proximity to power reshapes people in ways that are rarely visible until damage is irreversible. Awareness that silence protects systems, not individuals. Awareness that some families do not fail. They are spent. Where reckoning leaves us. The Cornwallis West family did not receive justice. They received exposure, slow, uneven, and incomplete. But exposure changes how stories function. Once a method is visible, it loses innocence. And that is where this reckoning ends, not in resolution, but in responsibility shifted to the listener. Because now that the structure is clear, the question is no longer historical, it is present. Who is absorbing the cost of power today, quietly, legally, and without apology? Episode 9 does not answer that question. It insists that we cannot unsee it, and that insistence is the closest thing to justice this story will ever offer. Reckonings are supposed to be loud. They arrive with trials, confessions, collapses, moments when history pauses and declares that something has been understood, judged, and corrected. The story of the Cornwallis West family offers no such satisfaction. There was no trial, no apology, no institutional admission of harm, and that absence is not accidental. Why power avoids reckoning? Power survives by continuity, not by correction. To acknowledge wrongdoing is to introduce fracture, to admit that the system itself, not merely its participants, failed. For the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the social order that sustained them, such an admission was unthinkable. So the reckoning was deferred, not denied, not resolved, simply postponed, passed downward, outward, and forward in time. Families like the Cornwallis Wests became repositories for unresolved consequence. Their lives absorbed what institutions could not afford to confront. And because no single act violated the norms of the era, there was nothing to prosecute. Everything was proper. Everything was discreet. Everything was devastating. The comfort of individual blame. History often seeks relief by narrowing responsibility. It is easier to blame Patsy's ambition, Daisy's indiscretions, George's instability than to confront the architecture that shaped them. Individual blame comforts us. It suggests that different choices could have produced different outcomes, that the system itself was sound. The Cornwallis West story refuses that comfort. Every major turning point in their lives was structurally incentivized. The marriage that contained scandal, the alliances that traded daughters for stability, the silence that preserved hierarchy, the exile of those who became inconvenient. To focus on personal failure is to miss the design. Silence as an outcome, not a cause. One of the great misinterpretations of this story is the belief that silence caused the damage. Silence was the result. It emerged because speaking offered no protection, no repair, and no justice. It was not cowardice, it was information. Patsy learned early that exposure brought punishment, not correction. Daisy learned that honesty produced isolation. George learned that uncertainty, once voiced, invited ridicule rather than understanding. Constance learned fastest. She learned that disengagement was the only reliable defense. This is how systems teach. They do not instruct, they condition. The family as a holding space. Viewed through this lens. The Cornwallis West family functioned as a holding space for contradiction. They held the monarchy's indulgences, the aristocracy's hypocrisies, society's double standards, gendered expectations without accountability. And holding space has a cost. It demands emotional labor without acknowledgement. It requires stability without support. It absorbs pressure until collapse or withdrawal occurs. The family's dissolution was not failure. It was release. Why there is no redemption. Arc. Modern storytelling expects redemption. It wants the final chapter to restore balance, to locate meaning in suffering. But redemption would imply that something was fixed. Nothing was. The structures that shaped the Cornwallis West story did not disappear when the family faded. They adapted. They modernized. They learned new languages of legitimacy. What ended was not the system, but this family's role within it, and that distinction matters. The listener's discomfort. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, not because of scandal, but because of recognition. Listeners begin to sense that the Cornwallis West family was not unique. They were simply visible. Their proximity to royalty preserved records. Their wealth ensured documentation. Their marriages crossed borders that historians cared to track. Countless others lived parallel stories without names history bothered to remember. That realization strips away the safety of distance. This is not a story about them. It is a story about how things work, what reckoning actually looks like. If reckoning does not arrive as punishment or apology, what does it look like? In this story, it looks like reinterpretation instead of condemnation, distance instead of repair, withdrawal instead of revolt, awareness instead of closure. The reckoning occurs not in institutions, but in understanding. Understanding does not heal the past, but it prevents repetition from feeling inevitable. The unanswered question. Episode 9 does not end with a solution. It ends with a pressure point. Once we recognize how power distributes cost, quietly, legally, and unevenly, we are forced to confront a question that history cannot answer for us. When silence is the only survivable response, who benefits from that silence? The Cornwallis West family answered that question with their lives. They paid so others would not have to, and because no reckoning ever came. The debt did not disappear, it merely changed hands. The final part of this episode will not offer closure. It will confront the only thing left, what it means to inherit awareness in a world that still runs on denial. If power refuses to reckon, then reckoning falls elsewhere. It falls to those who come after, to those who notice patterns, to those who inherit awareness instead of authority. This is the final burden carried by the Cornwallis West family, and by anyone who truly understands their story. When awareness replaces innocence. Earlier generations of the Cornwallis Wests lived inside the system without seeing it. They believed proximity meant protection. Silence meant safety. Endurance meant virtue. By the time the family story reached its final phase, those beliefs were no longer possible. The descendants did not grow up believing in aristocratic inevitability. They grew up knowing that everything their ancestors had treated as permanent, rank, access, discretion, had proven fragile. This knowledge changed the nature of inheritance. They did not inherit guilt. They inherited clarity, and clarity is not comforting. The weight of seeing clearly awareness brings responsibility, not the legal kind, but the existential kind. Once you understand how a system distributes cost, you cannot unknow it. You begin to recognize the signs everywhere. Who is asked to stay quiet? Who is praised for endurance? Who absorbs discomfort so others can remain unchallenged? Who is discarded once usefulness ends? The Cornwallis West descendants did not articulate these patterns publicly, but they lived with them privately, shaping their choices in ways that history will never record. They chose distance over access. They chose privacy over prestige. They chose ordinary lives over symbolic ones, not because they were fearful, but because they understood the price. Awareness without power. There is a cruel asymmetry in awareness. Those who see the system most clearly are often the least positioned to change it. The Cornwallis Wests no longer held influence. They could not reform institutions. They could not demand accountability. All they could do was refuse participation. Refusal does not look heroic. It does not create headlines. It does not rewrite laws. But it disrupts one essential function of power: availability. By refusing to serve as buffers, intermediaries, or absorbers of consequence, the family ended its usefulness to the system that once relied on it. That refusal is the quietest form of resistance. Why this is not a victory story. It is tempting to frame the family's final chapter as triumph, a liberation from power, a return to normalcy. It is not. Nothing was won. There was no compensation for suffering, no acknowledgement of harm, no moment when the system admitted fault. The family did not escape with prizes. They escaped with limits. Limits on ambition, limits on exposure, limits on how much of themselves they were willing to trade for recognition. This is not redemption. It is containment. The listener's responsibility at this stage. The story no longer belongs to the Cornwallis Wests. It belongs to the listener, because awareness, once transmitted, cannot be returned. You now recognize how power preserves itself through silence. Systems outsource emotional cost. Families become infrastructure without consent. Reckoning is avoided by deflection and delay. This recognition demands something, not action necessarily, but attention. Attention to who is being asked to endure quietly. Attention to who is praised for discretion. Attention to who is handled rather than helped. The story trains the listener not to admire power, but to examine its edges. The final inheritance. The Cornwallis West family's true inheritance was not tragedy. It was instruction. Instruction without a manual. Instruction without protection. Instruction that arrived too late to save them, but not too late to be useful. Their lives demonstrate that the most dangerous position is not at the top of power, nor at the bottom. It is just close enough to be useful, and just far enough to be expendable. Where the reckoning ends. Episode 9 does not conclude with healing. It concludes with a boundary between spectacle and understanding, between fascination and responsibility, between consuming stories and learning from them. The Cornwallis Wests were consumed by a system that never needed to acknowledge them. Their final contribution is not warning, but clarity, and clarity, once achieved, does not ask to be admired. It asks to be remembered. When stories reach their final chapter, there is usually an attempt to soften the landing, a lesson neatly summarized, a moral made explicit, a sense that suffering has been redeemed by meaning. The story of the Cornwallis West family offers none of that comfort. What it offers instead is something colder and more honest. What remains when everything that once mattered is gone. After power, after scandal, after memory. By the time the last living connections to the Cornwallis West saga faded into private life, nothing dramatic marked the end. No estate fell in flames. No title was stripped in disgrace. No final confrontation settled accounts. There was simply absence. The rooms once filled with royalty stood quiet. The names once whispered with caution became archival. The relationships once managed with surgical precision dissolved into genealogy charts and footnotes. What had once required constant attention no longer required anything at all. And that, more than tragedy, defines the end, what history keeps and what it discards. History is selective, but not sentimental. It does not preserve people. It preserves patterns. From the Cornwallis West family, history retained only what was structurally useful. The teenage girl absorbed into royal secrecy, the marriage designed to neutralize risk, the children elevated beyond emotional safety, the silence that protected institutions, the gradual dispersal once usefulness ended, everything else, the private doubts, the unspoken regrets, the moments of kindness, was discarded. Not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked function. This is how power leaves its mark, not by remembering individuals, but by repeating methods. The coldness of the ending. There is no warmth in this conclusion because warmth suggests closure. The Cornwallis West story does not close, it empties. What once felt urgent becomes inert. What once demanded silence now receives none. The family's proximity to power evaporates, revealing how little substance remained once access was gone. This is the cold truth beneath aristocratic mythology. When power withdraws, it does not take responsibility with it. It leaves behind debris. The final state of each life. Patsy Fitzpatrick died disgraced, not because she failed, but because she outlived protection. Daisy died reflective, not vindicated, her voice preserved, her wounds unresolved. George died deliberately, choosing control where none remained. Constance lived long and quietly, not triumphant, simply intact. None of these endings correct the system that shaped them. They merely show its limits. What remains for the descendants? For the generations that followed? The family name became neither burden nor asset. It became neutral. A past to acknowledge briefly, a story to explain occasionally, a context that no longer dictated choices. This neutrality is not emptiness, it is release. The descendants inherited no duty to continue the narrative, no expectation to redeem it, no role to perform. They inherited the freedom to stop, the absence of meaning, and why it matters. The most unsettling aspect of this ending is the absence of imposed meaning. There is no final judgment declaring who was right or wrong, no cosmic balance restoring fairness, no assurance that suffering produced improvement. The story ends because systems do not care how stories end. They care only that they functioned while needed. Meaning, if it exists, must be constructed by the listener. The listener's final position. At this point, the story no longer asks for empathy alone. It asks for recognition. Recognition of how easily power externalizes cost. Recognition of how silence masquerades as stability. Recognition of how families become instruments without consent. This recognition is uncomfortable because it implicates the present. The Cornwallis West family is not a relic. It is a precedent. The cold ending defined. A cold ending does not comfort. It does not console. It does not absolve. It simply states, this happened. It was allowed. And it ended not with justice, but with dispersal. That is what remains after everything. And in that stillness, the story prepares to close, not with a moral, but with a final observation. Because once the noise is gone, once the scandal fades, once the power moves on, what remains is not legacy. It is evidence. There is a moment after every long story when nothing more can be added without distortion. The Cornwallis West family reached that moment not with finality, but with quiet. No one announced the end. No one closed the record. No one reclaimed the narrative. The story simply stopped asking to be continued when silence stops being strategic for generations. Silence had been a tool. It was used to protect reputations, to manage scandal, to preserve access, to defer consequence. But in the final stage of the Cornwallis West story, silence changed its nature. It was no longer strategic. It was empty. No favors required it. No institutions demanded it. No power depended on it. Silence, once enforced, became voluntary, and voluntary silence carries a different meaning. The end of performance. Earlier members of the family lived under constant performance. Every relationship was calculated. Every appearance was curated. Every absence was explained. In the end, performance lost its audience. Without proximity to power, there was nothing left to perform for. The family no longer needed to manage impressions because no one was watching closely enough to be managed. This is how aristocratic stories truly end, not with rebellion or reform, but with irrelevance. and irrelevance, unlike disgrace, offers no drama. The quietest outcome. The Cornwallis West descendants did not mark the end of their family's historical moment. They lived it. They moved houses. They changed professions. They married outside expectation. They raised children without instruction in discretion or leverage. They lived ordinary lives, not because they rejected their past, but because they refused to repeat it. This ordinariness was not accidental. It was chosen. Silence as boundary. In the final accounting, silence became a boundary rather than a weapon, a boundary between history and identity, narrative and self. What happened and what continues? By not speaking, the family declined participation in its own mythology. This refusal did not erase the past. It prevented its replication. What the story leaves unsaid. Some questions remain unanswered. Did Patsy regret her choices? Did Daisy forgive herself? Did George ever find peace? Did Constance feel vindicated? History does not know, and that ignorance is appropriate. These questions assume that inner resolution matters more than structural consequence. The Cornwallis West story is not about inner peace. It is about what systems demand and what happens to those who supply it. The final state. In the end, nothing was repaired, but something was contained. The family did not collapse spectacularly. They did not reclaim power. They did not seek absolution. They dispersed. And dispersion, in this case, was not failure. It was the only form of stability left. Why the silence matters. Silence at the end of a story is often mistaken for emptiness. It is not. It is saturation. Everything that needed to be said has already been said. By events, by outcomes, by absence. To add more would be indulgence. The last line that isn't spoken. The Cornwallis West story ends without a declaration. No voice steps forward to explain. No authority grants judgment. No lesson is underlined. There is only a final condition. The system continues. The family does not. And in that imbalance lies the truth this story leaves behind. Power does not remember those it uses. History remembers patterns, not people. Silence is not always imposed. Sometimes it is the only sane response. This is the last silence, and it is complete. Most stories end by tying their threads together. This one does not. The story of the Cornwallis West family does not resolve because the forces that shaped it never resolved either. They simply moved on, leaving behind lives altered beyond repair and lessons that no institution ever formally acknowledged. And that is why the ending must remain open. When closure is a fiction, closure suggests that something broken has been fixed, or at least understood well enough to be put away. But closure is a luxury afforded only to those with power. The Cornwallis Wests were never granted that luxury. Their lives were shaped by arrangements they did not design, silences they did not fully choose, and consequences they were required to absorb. When their usefulness ended, they were released, not healed. This is not tragedy. It is procedure. The family as afterimage. What remains of the Cornwallis West family today is not presence, but afterimage. A faint outline in historical texts, a recurring footnote in royal biographies, a story rediscovered when someone asks the wrong question about how power once worked. They exist now only in reference, and reference is impersonal. It does not carry emotion. It does not grant justice. It does not care whether anyone was ready for what happened. The illusion of the ending. The temptation at this point is to impose meaning, to declare that the family's suffering exposed injustice, that their endurance led to progress, that awareness prevents repetition. History offers no such guarantee. Systems adapt, power rebrands, costs shift to new intermediaries. The Cornwallis West story did not end because it succeeded. It ended because it was no longer needed. What the story refuses to do. This ending refuses to moralize individuals, to absolve institutions, to console the listener, to promise improvement instead. It leaves a void where certainty might otherwise sit. That void is intentional. The listener's position at the end. At the end of this story, the listener occupies an uncomfortable place. You are not asked to judge. You are not asked to forgive. You are not asked to admire. You are asked to notice how power distributes cost, to notice how silence is incentivized, to notice how families become instruments, to notice how endings often arrive without acknowledgement. The story does not tell you what to do with this awareness. It only insists that you carry it. The final truth. The final truth of the Cornwallis West saga is not hidden. It is plain. Power does not collapse when it harms. It collapses when it is no longer useful. Families close to power are not protected by it. They are shaped and eventually discarded. There is no final reckoning here because reckoning would imply accountability. What exists instead is memory, and memory, unlike justice, does not intervene. The ending that stops. This is not an ending that closes the book. It is an ending that sets it down. The story stops not because it has nothing left to say, but because saying more would repeat the same pattern, extracting meaning without offering repair. The Cornwallis West family has already given everything the story can take. What remains is silence. Not empty silence, not dramatic silence, but the silence that follows understanding. And that silence is where the story truly ends.